Hello, everyone. My name is Calvin, and I am 64 years old. I have spent my entire life up to my elbows in grease copper wire and ductwork as a master electrician and HVAC business owner right here in Atlanta. If you think a lifetime of breaking your back to provide for your only son earns you a shred of respect on his wedding day, you are dead wrong. The biggest shock of my life was not a blown commercial transformer. It was my future daughter-in-law pointing at my mud-caked work boots in front of 100 wealthy guests and sneering that the dirty janitor can stand outside. But she did not know I was the one holding the checkbook. And she certainly did not know my son was about to hand me the microphone to expose exactly where her wedding funds had really gone. The tension started long before that disastrous wedding day. It started the moment my son Trey brought Chloe into our lives. To understand why I put up with her family's blatant disrespect, you have to understand where I came from. As a young African-American man in the South, nobody handed me a single thing. When I say I built my company from a rusted-out van, I mean I worked 18-hour days in the blistering Georgia summer heat. I crawled through dark, rat-infested attics filled with fiberglass insulation while my muscles screamed for rest. I did it because I looked at my baby boy and promised myself he would never have to wipe grease off his face to earn $1. My late wife Simone and I scraped every penny together. She worked as a public school teacher, bringing home meager paychecks, but a wealth of love. We sacrificed our own comfort so Trey could sit in pristine lecture halls with the sons of politicians and CEOs. And he made us proud. Trey graduated at the top of his law school class. But for all his book smarts, my son was blind when it came to matters of the heart. That blindness was born from a deep, aching loss. When Simone was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, my world stopped spinning. I spent everything we had on experimental treatments, flying her to specialists, praying for a miracle. But the cancer was relentless. In her final hours with the hospital machines, humming that terrible, steady rhythm, she pulled me close. Her breathing was shallow, her body frail, but her eyes held a fierce light. She whispered to me that Trey is brilliant, but he sees the good in everyone. She said he does not see the wolves. She made me swear to be his eyes to protect him when she was gone. I kissed her forehead and made that vow to God and to her. I would rather die than see my son destroyed. Then came Chloe. Chloe was a vision in expensive white lace, but her heart was cold. She came from a world of old money and staggering arrogance. Her father, Richard, was a ruthless real estate developer who built his fortune stepping on working-class men like me. From the day we met, Richard made it clear we were not equals. He would invite us to his massive gated estate in Buckhead and make subtle cutting remarks about the help and how tradesmen just did not understand complex finance. I swallowed my pride every single time. I kept my mouth shut and smiled because Trey was completely blinded by love. My son saw a beautiful, sophisticated woman. I saw a predator waiting to strike. Richard was a man who wore his white privilege like a weapon. During one Sunday dinner at his sprawling mansion, we sat in a dining room larger than my entire house. Richard swirled his expensive bourbon, looked at my scarred hands, and smiled a tight, venomous smile. He asked if I still did the dirty work myself, or if I had finally hired enough cheap labor to sit at a desk. He said it must be fascinating working with my hands, but he preferred moving capital because it required a different type of intellect. It was a calculated insult wrapped in a velvet tone. He wanted me to know that no matter how successful my business was, I would always be just a laborer in his eyes, a black tradesman who somehow stumbled into his pristine world. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I looked across the table at Trey. My son was holding Chloe's hand, looking at her like she was the only woman on earth. For his sake, I swallowed the anger. I smiled politely and told Richard that hard work builds character, something money cannot buy. Richard did not like that answer, and from that moment on, a silent war was declared. The financial manipulation started months before the wedding. Richard insisted that since Trey was marrying into a high society family, the wedding had to reflect their elite status. They booked the Piedmont Estate, a venue that costs more for one night than I made in my first 5 years of business. But when the massive bills arrived, Richard suddenly claimed his liquid assets were temporarily tied up in a commercial zoning dispute. It was an obvious lie, a cruel power play to test how much he could extract from us. He pulled Trey aside, patted his shoulder, and said, "A real man provides for his bride." Trey was a junior lawyer, already drowning in student loans. He was panicked, pacing our living room, terrified that Chloe would cancel the wedding if she did not get her dream venue. That is when I stepped in. Remembering my vow to Simone, I went to the bank. I withdrew $150,000 from my hard-earned life savings and handed it to Trey. I thought I was buying my son's happiness. I thought I was shielding him from heartbreak. I had no idea I was funding a massive, sickening betrayal. The morning of the wedding arrived with a thick, humid heat that only Georgia can produce in the middle of July. We were at the Piedmont Estate. The grounds were immaculate, with manicured hedges and white folding chairs lined up on a sweeping emerald lawn. I stood in the lobby wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a deep sense of pride. I was just an old tradesman, but I was watching my boy get married in a place where people like me usually only enter through the service door. But that pride was cut short by a sound I know all too well. A heavy, loud pop echoed from deep beneath the floorboards, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The massive crystal chandeliers above us flickered and died. The gentle hum of the central air conditioning completely stopped. Within minutes, the grand ballroom turned into an oven. Panic started to ripple through the staff. I watched the venue manager sprinting down the hall, wiping sweat from his forehead, with a panicked look in his eyes. I grabbed his shoulder and asked him straight out what just happened. He looked at me with pure desperation and said the main electrical panel in the basement just blew. The entire cooling and power system for the estate was completely fried. He told me the city utility crew could not get a team out there for at least 6 hours. The wedding was scheduled to start in 2 hours. $150,000 of caterers, lighting, florists, and musicians were about to be completely ruined by a massive power failure. I saw Trey standing near the bridal suite, staring blankly at the dark hallway. My son looked absolutely broken. He had already endured so much stress dealing with Richard and his impossible demands. I could see the panic rising in his chest. I knew Chloe was somewhere in the back, screaming at the staff and blaming Trey for the disaster. I could not let my son's wedding day collapse into a humiliating disaster. I made a promise to his mother that I would protect him, and I meant it. I told the manager to get me the utility blueprints for the basement right now. He looked confused, but he was too desperate to argue. He handed me a rolled-up set of schematics. I took one look and knew exactly what needed to be done. It was a massive commercial panel and a blown main feed. It was dangerous high-voltage work, but it was nothing I had not seen 1,000 times before. I ran out to the employee parking lot, where I had parked my trusty heavy-duty work truck. I always drove my truck everywhere out of pure habit. I climbed into the cab and carefully took off my expensive tuxedo jacket. I unbuttoned my crisp white shirt and folded my trousers, placing them gently on the passenger seat. I reached behind the seat and grabbed my heavy canvas coveralls. They were stained with years of grease and hard labor, but they were the tools of my trade. I pulled on my thick leather work boots, grabbed my heavy tool bag, and headed straight for the service entrance. The manager pointed me toward a rusted iron door tucked away behind the kitchens. It led down into a pitch-black crawl space that ran directly under the historic mansion. As soon as I opened the door, the smell of stagnant water and mold hit my face like a physical blow. The heat down there was suffocating. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight and lowered myself into the dark. I am 64 years old. My knees do not bend like they used to, and my back carries the ache of 40 years of heavy lifting. But I pushed through the pain. I crawled on my belly through thick, wet mud. The ceiling was so low it scraped against my shoulders. I could hear the distinct scurrying sounds of rats fleeing from the beam of my light. Cobwebs stuck to my face and dirty water soaked through my coveralls, chilling my skin despite the sweltering heat. I finally reached the main electrical housing. It was a complete nightmare. A huge section of the commercial wiring had completely melted down due to a massive power surge. The air conditioning compressors had drawn too much power, and the old breakers simply gave up. I had to completely bypass the ruined section and splice thick, heavy-gauge copper wires by hand. I set my flashlight on a muddy brick and got to work. The air was so thick with humidity I could barely breathe. Sweat poured down my forehead and stung my eyes. My hands cramped as I wrestled with the heavy cables. The sharp edge of a rusted pipe sliced open my forearm, but I did not stop. I wiped the blood on my sleeve and kept stripping wire. Every muscle in my body was screaming for me to quit. The heat was making me dizzy, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around me. But every time I felt like dropping my tools, I thought about Trey. I thought about the look of defeat on his face upstairs. I thought about how hard I had worked my entire life to give him a day of pure joy. I was not going to let a piece of burnt copper ruin my son's life. For 3 grueling hours, I laid in that mud fighting with the electrical panel. I taped, I spliced, I grounded, and I prayed. Finally, my hands trembling from exhaustion, I gripped the massive heavy metal breaker switch. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and slammed the switch upward. A loud mechanical clunk echoed through the damp basement. A second later, the beautiful, glorious sound of giant commercial air conditioning units roaring back to life vibrated through the floorboards above me. The emergency lights clicked off, and the bright, steady glow of regular power flooded the cracks in the ceiling. I had done it. I had brought the entire estate back online. I let out a long, ragged breath and leaned my head back against the muddy brick wall. My entire body was shaking from the physical toll. My coveralls were completely soaked with sweat and mud. My boots were caked in thick brown sludge. My hands were covered in black grease and dried blood. But none of that mattered. The reception was saved. The food would stay cold, the music would play, and my son would have his perfect wedding. I gathered my heavy tools and began the slow, painful crawl back toward the iron door. Every inch of my body ached, but my heart felt light. I pulled myself out of the dark, rat-infested hole and stood up in the bright afternoon sun. I took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling the satisfaction of a job well done. I wiped my greasy forehead with the back of my hand and started walking toward the main lobby. I just wanted to find Trey and tell him everything was going to be all right. I had no idea that my sacrifice was about to be met with the cruelest humiliation of my entire life. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors that separated the service hallway from the main lobby. The sudden blast of ice-cold air conditioning hit my face, a stark and freezing reminder of the miracle I had just pulled off down in the dark. The grand foyer of the Piedmont estate was an absolute vision of luxury. It was a sprawling sea of sparkling crystal chandeliers, towering arrangements of white orchids and immaculate gold trim. Soft, elegant string music floated through the background, barely masking the low, polite murmur of Atlanta's most elite circles. Wealthy guests draped in tailored silk dresses and expensive designer suits were mingling effortlessly, holding delicate crystal flutes of imported champagne. And then there was me. I stood at the edge of the room looking like a walking disaster area. My heavy canvas coveralls were plastered from collar to cuff, with foul-smelling basement sludge, wet clay, and thick black axle grease. A slow, steady trickle of blood from the jagged cut on my forearm, mixed with the dark grime covering my wrist. My heavy leather work boots left thick brown footprints on the pristine marble floor. I stuck out like a sore thumb in this palace of wealth, but I honestly did not care about the optics. I was only looking for my boy. I wanted to catch Trey's eye across the room to give him a simple nod, a silent fatherly signal that his old man had handled the crisis, and his perfect day was completely back on track. I spotted Trey standing near the sweeping grand staircase. He looked incredibly dashing in his custom-tailored tuxedo, though the knot of anxiety was still visibly tight around his jawline. I took a hopeful step forward, raising a filthy, calloused hand to catch his attention. But before my son could even see me, a solid wall of white satin and imported French lace blocked my path. It was Chloe. She was flanked by a tight circle of her high society bridesmaids. They were the kind of women who looked like they had never lifted a finger for a hard day of honest work in their entire privileged lives. The moment Chloe laid her icy blue eyes on me, her fake camera-ready wedding smile vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by a contortion of absolute, unadulterated disgust. The women gathered around her actually gasped out loud. They physically stepped back, clutching their expensive clutches and covering their noses as if my very presence was infecting the pure air they breathed. The soft, polite chatter in our corner of the grand lobby died an instant, awkward death. I tried to offer a gentle, reassuring smile, wanting to quickly explain that the massive power failure was fixed and the reception was saved. I opened my mouth to speak, but she did not let a single syllable out. She looked me up and down with eyes completely devoid of any human respect. Her voice was sharp, piercing, and loud enough to intentionally draw the attention of the surrounding affluent crowd. It cut right through the beautiful string quartet music echoing off the high ceilings. She asked, her tone dripping with unhidden venom, "Who let the dirty janitor in here?" She sneered, waving a perfectly manicured hand toward the service doors behind me. She told me to go stand outside so I did not ruin her aesthetic. The dirty janitor. Those words hit my chest harder than a physical punch from a heavyweight fighter. I am a master electrician. I am a proud business owner who built a company from nothing but sweat and determination. I am the man who had just risked his own failing health in a rat-infested crawl space to save her party. Most importantly, I am the man who single-handedly financed every single flower, every drop of that expensive champagne, and the very roof over her head at this exact moment. Yet to this woman, the mud on my boots completely erased my humanity. To her, I was just a piece of uneducated trash ruining the background of her flawless wedding photos. Before I could even fully process the sheer staggering audacity of her insult, her father Richard stepped out from the whispering crowd. He stood tall in his tailored charcoal suit, holding a tumbler of bourbon, wearing that same smug, predatory grin I had grown to deeply despise. He placed a heavy hand on his daughter's lace-covered shoulder and let out a dry, condescending laugh. He looked at me, shaking his head slowly, with mock pity. He told Chloe not to be too harsh on me today. He said, "You have to understand that these people are just used to wallowing in the dirt." He chuckled, looking around at his wealthy, powerful friends who offered polite, highly uncomfortable smiles in return. Then he looked me right in the eye, his gaze cold and dead, and said, "It is always best to let the help stick to their natural habitat." The racial undertone was not even hidden. It was not a mistake. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of white superiority meant to completely strip away my dignity and loudly remind me of my supposed place in his world. My heavy fists clenched tightly at my sides. A lifetime of fighting for basic respect as a black man in the South flared up in my chest like a raging inferno. I wanted to roar, I wanted to tear down this entire fake, pretentious facade and expose them for the greedy leeches they were right then and there. I wanted to scream that my money paid for the very drink in his hand, but I looked past Richard's smug face and saw Trey. This was my only son's wedding day, the day he had dreamed of and planned for. If I reacted with the anger burning in my veins, I would instantly become the angry, unhinged old man who ruined everything. They would use it against me forever. I swallowed a lump of bitter, burning pride that tasted like ash in my mouth. I nodded silently, took a slow, heavy step backward, and prepared to walk out the service door into the sweltering, unforgiving heat. I chose to bear the ultimate humiliation just to protect my son's peace of mind. But as I retreated into the dark shadows of the service hallway, I saw Trey striding purposefully toward the crowd. He had heard every single word. The crippling anxiety that had gripped his face all morning was entirely gone. In its place was a dark, quiet, terrifying fury I had never seen in my boy before. He did not look at his beautiful bride. He did not acknowledge her arrogant, racist father. He walked straight past their bewildered, arrogant faces with a heavy, determined stride that demanded absolute silence. He marched directly across the pristine marble floor, climbed the carpeted steps to the elevated DJ booth, and firmly snatched the microphone right out of the entertainer's hand. A sharp, piercing screech of microphone feedback suddenly ripped through the elegant hum of the grand foyer. It was so loud and so violently unexpected that it made the hired string quartet abruptly stop playing mid-note. Dozens of crystal champagne flutes stopped halfway to the lips of Atlanta's elite. I had my hand pressed flat against the heavy brass pushplate of the service door, fully prepared to slip away into the sweltering Georgia heat and vanish like a ghost. I wanted to spare my boy the embarrassment of my muddy, grease-stained presence, but that piercing electronic squeal froze me right in my tracks. I turned my head slowly, looking back over my shoulder toward the elevated DJ booth at the far end of the marble room. Trey was standing there, gripping the heavy metal microphone so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his custom-tailored tuxedo. The crippling, suffocating anxiety that had plagued him all morning was entirely gone, burned away by a sudden and terrifying clarity. I had spent his entire life trying to shield him from the ugly, vicious realities of this world, hoping he would only ever see the good in people. But looking at his face in that moment, I realized my boy was no longer blind. The wool had been violently ripped from his eyes. He stared down at Chloe, his beautiful bride in her expensive imported lace, and then shifted his dark, furious gaze to her father Richard, who was still wearing that smug, racist smirk. Trey brought the microphone to his lips. His voice echoed through the massive speakers, booming off the high vaulted ceilings and shaking the crystal chandeliers I had just risked my life to power back on. "Dad," he commanded, his voice thick with emotion and trembling with an absolute, undeniable authority. "Do not, you dare, move a single inch. Do not push that door open. You stay right where you are." Every single pair of eyes in that sprawling, opulent lobby instantly snapped away from the wedding stage and locked directly onto me. 100 wealthy, privileged guests turned to stare at the old black man, covered in basement sludge, wet clay, and dried blood. A few minutes ago, those same eyes had looked at me with pure disgust. Now they were wide with confusion and rising alarm. Trey stepped down from the booth, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center of the dance floor. He did not break eye contact with me. "I want to introduce everyone in this room to the man standing by the service exit," Trey announced to the silent, breathless crowd. A few moments ago, my lovely bride decided to call him a dirty janitor. Her father found it incredibly amusing to suggest that a man who works with his hands belongs outside, out of sight, like an animal. Well, let me correct the record right now. That man is Calvin. He is a master electrician. He is a veteran of the trades, and he is my father. I felt a massive painful lump form thick and heavy in the back of my throat. My vision blurred with hot, stinging tears that I desperately tried to blink away. For years, I had quietly swallowed the microaggressions, the condescending pats on the back, and the thinly veiled insults from Chloe's family, all just to keep the peace for my son. To hear him stand up in front of the most powerful people in Buckhead and claim me loudly and proudly was a vindication that shook me to my absolute core. Trey continued, his voice growing louder, echoing with a righteous anger that demanded attention. You are all standing here in the cool air conditioning. You are admiring the lights and waiting for a 5-course meal. But what none of you know is that 2 hours ago, the entire main power feed in the basement of this historic estate completely blew out. The management told us the party was over. The wedding was ruined. But my father took off his tuxedo, put on his work gear, and crawled into a pitch-black, rat-infested crawl space. He spent 3 hours lying in deep mud, risking his own failing health, splicing high-voltage cables with his bare, bleeding hands, just so this reception could happen. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Chloe, who was suddenly looking remarkably small inside her massive, extravagant gown. He did not do it for a paycheck. Trey spat out, his voice dripping with absolute venom. He did it because he loves me. His calloused, bleeding hands are the only reason any of us are standing in this room right now. Trey took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Richard. The wealthy real estate developer had completely lost his smug grin. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine and heard the dreadful click beneath his expensive Italian loafers. But that is not even the best part, Trey said, lowering his voice into a dangerous, razor-sharp tone that carried perfectly through the dead, silent room. Richard has spent the last year bragging to everyone in his country club about how he was throwing the wedding of the century for his little girl. He acted like the ultimate provider. But the truth is, when the massive bills actually came due, Richard claimed his cash was tied up. He claimed he could not pay. Trey turned back to the crowd, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. In fact, the dirty janitor you all just laughed at is the sole reason you have food, drinks, and a roof over your heads. My father, the black tradesman you wanted to banish to the parking lot, wrote the $150,000 check to pay for this entire party. The silence that fell over the Piedmont estate was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum of sound. You could have heard a single pin drop onto the marble floor. The sheer magnitude of the revelation crashed into the room like a tidal wave. I watched as Chloe turned a sickly, translucent shade of ghost pale. The haughty, aristocratic sneer melted right off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked frantically at her bridesmaids, the same women who had gasped in horror at my muddy boots just minutes earlier. Now those women were stepping away from her, their faces flushed with deep, agonizing embarrassment. They lowered their heads suddenly, finding the intricate patterns on the marble floor utterly fascinating. Richard looked as if all the air had been violently punched out of his lungs. His face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find a clever remark or a threatening retort to regain his stolen authority, but he was completely speechless. The great, powerful real estate titan had been publicly stripped bare, exposed as a complete fraud who was secretly banking on the hard-earned savings of the very man he had just racially degraded. I stood by the service doors, my muddy boots planted firmly on the pristine floor, and I did not step back anymore. I stood tall. The grime on my hands and the sweat on my brow no longer felt like a mark of shame. They felt like a badge of honor. My son had seen the truth, and he had chosen me. Trey did not stop there. The crushing weight of the silence in that grand foyer was not enough for him. He turned away from the DJ booth, completely ignoring the collective gasps of the wealthy onlookers, and marched straight toward the massive audiovisual console set up near the bridal arch. I watched my son pull his smartphone from his tuxedo pocket. His hands were completely steady. The crippling anxiety that had suffocated him all morning was replaced by a chilling, absolute resolve. He grabbed a display cable from the bewildered technician's table and plugged it directly into his device. Trey spoke into the microphone again, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a raw, jagged edge. He told the crowd that the power failure in the basement was not the only disaster he had been forced to deal with today. Early this morning, while his beautiful bride was sipping mimosas and getting her hair styled, he received a frantic phone call. It was the head caterer threatening to pull the entire 5-course menu because their final payment had bounced. Then the florist called with the exact same story. Trey looked directly at Chloe, whose pale face was now contorting into a mask of pure panic. He told the guests that he was confused because his father had generously transferred $150,000 into their joint wedding account 2 weeks ago. Every single vendor should have been paid in full. A massive 10-foot projection screen behind the bridal arch suddenly flickered to life. The bright blue light washed over the imported floral arrangements, casting long, harsh shadows across the room. On the screen was a blown-up high-definition image of a bank statement. Trey pointed at the glowing numbers. He told everyone to look closely at the highlighted transactions. He explained that when the vendors called, he logged into the account to see exactly where the error occurred. That was when he discovered that $100,000 of my hard-earned money had vanished into thin air. It did not go to the catering company. It did not go to the estate management. It certainly did not go to the florists. Trey swiped his phone screen, and the projection changed to a series of wire transfer receipts. He read the recipient's name out loud. It was a name that made Chloe let out a strangled, desperate noise. It was a man named Preston. My son's voice hardened like forged steel. He informed the shocked crowd that Preston was not a wedding planner. Preston was Chloe's ex-boyfriend, a man who happened to be drowning in massive, dangerous underground gambling debts. A man who owed very bad people a lot of money. Trey explained the timeline step by step, laying out the undeniable evidence for her elite social circle to consume. As soon as I had deposited my life savings into their account, Chloe systematically siphoned off $100,000, wiring it in staggered amounts to offshore accounts to bail out her former lover. She had planned to let the wedding checks bounce today, hoping Trey would be too distracted by the ceremony to notice. She figured her wealthy father would quietly step in and cover the deficit later to save face, sweeping her massive theft under the rug. The collective gasp from the high society guests was absolutely deafening. Whispers erupted like a swarm of angry hornets. I stood by the service doors, my heart breaking for my boy, but also swelling with an immense, fierce pride. He was handling this ultimate betrayal with the quiet strength of a lion. Chloe took a step forward, her hands trembling violently. She tried to speak, trying to construct a lie, but the glowing bank statements towering above her made any denial utterly impossible. Her own signature authorized the wires. Trey looked at the woman he had loved, the woman he was supposed to marry in less than an hour. His eyes were devoid of any affection. He spoke slowly, making sure every single syllable echoed through the vast hall. He told her that she did not just betray him. She stole from a man who broke his back for 40 years to give his son a better life. She looked down on the very hands that financed her salvation from a dangerous syndicate. Then Trey delivered the final fatal blow. He announced to the silent captive audience that there would be no wedding today. He declared the engagement completely over. He told the guests to grab a glass of whatever champagne was left and go home because he was entirely done with this family and their toxic lies. The facade of the poised, elegant socialite shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the marble columns. It was not a cry of heartbreak or remorse. It was the screech of a spoiled, entitled child who had finally been caught and cornered with nowhere to run. She lunged forward, her heavy white gown tearing as her heel caught the hem. She screamed that Trey was ruining her life, that he was embarrassing her in front of her friends. She did not apologize for the theft. She did not show an ounce of regret for the financial devastation she almost caused. She was only furious that her perfect, pristine image had been publicly annihilated, with tears of pure rage streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Chloe raised her hand and swung wildly at Trey's face. She tried to slap him, her manicured nails aiming directly for his cheek. Trey did not even flinch. He simply caught her wrist mid-air. His grip was firm but incredibly restrained. He looked at her with a chilling, absolute disgust and firmly pushed her arm away. He told her to never touch him again. She stumbled backward, falling into the arms of her stunned bridesmaids, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her exposed deceit crashed down upon her. The elegant, sophisticated bride was gone, replaced by a weeping, exposed fraud on the marble floor. The piercing shriek from Chloe was still hanging in the humid air of the grand foyer when the real explosion happened. Richard had been standing frozen near the ice sculptures, his face a twisting map of shock, embarrassment, and pure, unfiltered rage. For a man who had spent his entire life controlling narratives and buying the silence of everyone around him, this sudden public exposure was an absolute nightmare. The polished mask of the wealthy Buckhead real estate tycoon shattered completely. He looked at his weeping daughter on the marble floor, and then his eyes locked fiercely onto Trey. I saw the violent shift in Richard's posture before he even moved a single muscle. When you spend decades working on dangerous construction sites, you learn to read the specific tension in a man's shoulders right before a fight breaks out. Richard let out a guttural sound that was halfway between a growl and a wild roar. He dropped his expensive crystal tumbler of bourbon, letting it shatter into 100 sparkling pieces across the polished floor. He lunged forward, charging straight at my son with his fists balled up tight. He yelled that nobody humiliates his family in his own town. He called Trey an ungrateful piece of trash, throwing in a vicious slur that echoed loudly through the stunned crowd. He fully intended to blindside my boy and tear him apart right there on the dance floor. But he forgot one crucial detail. He forgot about the dirty janitor standing just a few feet away. I did not even have to think. The primal instinct to protect my child overrode every single ache and pain in my 64-year-old joints. I stepped directly into Richard Warpath, planting my heavy steel-toed boots firmly on the slippery marble. As he charged blindly past the floral arrangements, I reached out and grabbed him by the lapels of his custom-tailored silk suit. Richard was a big man who spent thousands of dollars on personal trainers and fancy gym memberships. But there is a massive difference between lifting polished chrome weights in an air-conditioned room and hoisting commercial air conditioning units onto flatbed trucks in the blistering Georgia summer heat. 40 years of turning heavy wrenches, pulling thick gauge copper wire, and carrying cast iron pipes had built a kind of dense, unyielding strength in my bones that no country club membership could ever buy. His forward momentum crashed into me like a wave hitting a concrete seawall, but I did not budge a single inch. I twisted my grip on his lapels, stepped inside his guard, and used his own reckless weight against him. With one smooth, powerful motion, I swept his leg and drove him hard into the floor. The heavy impact actually shook the ground beneath us. Richard gasped, sputtering for air as the breath was knocked completely out of his lungs. I dropped my knee squarely onto his chest, pinning him down with the full, immovable weight of a lifelong tradesman. My hands, still caked in the thick black grease and dried clay from the basement, tightened around his pristine silk collar, ruining his expensive suit permanently. He thrashed wildly beneath me, swinging his arms and kicking his polished loafers against the floor, but it was absolutely useless. I held him down as easily as I would hold down a restless piece of sheet metal. I leaned in extremely close, so only he could hear the deep rumbling warning in my voice. I told him if he ever tried to lay a single hand on my son again, I would not be nearly this gentle. I looked deep into his terrified, widening eyes and let him see the raw, unfiltered fire of a father who had absolutely nothing to lose. I reminded him that all his money and all his arrogant power meant absolutely nothing down here on the ground. I told him he was nothing but a pathetic thief trying to cover up his own family rot. The fight had completely drained whatever fake courage Richard thought he possessed. He stopped struggling, laying flat on his back, wheezing and staring up at me with sheer disbelief. He finally realized that he had messed with the wrong family. All around us, the grand foyer had erupted into absolute pandemonium. The pristine, elegant wedding reception had devolved into a chaotic, frantic scramble. High society guests were literally pushing each other out of the way to reach the main exits. Women holding the hems of their expensive gowns were sprinting toward the valet stand, while the men aggressively barked into their cell phones, demanding their drivers pull up immediately. For Atlanta elite, there was nothing more terrifying than being associated with a very public, very dirty financial scandal. They were abandoning Richard and Chloe like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Then the distinct wailing sound of police sirens pierced through the evening air. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the tall glass windows of the Piedmont estate, washing over the ruined floral arrangements and the abandoned champagne glasses. Someone among the fleeing guests or the panicked venue staff had called 911 reporting a massive brawl. I slowly stood up, releasing my grip on Richard's ruined jacket. He scrambled backward, sliding across the marble floor like a frightened child, desperately trying to put distance between us. He crawled over to where Chloe was still sobbing hysterically on the ground, pulling her up and dragging her toward the back hallways to hide from the approaching officers. I did not pursue them. They were not worth another ounce of my energy. I turned around and looked at Trey. My son stood tall, his shoulders squared, his breathing steady. The look of profound respect and gratitude in his eyes was something I will carry with me until the day I die. He did not care about the canceled wedding anymore. He did not care about the lost money or the social fallout. In that moment, he only cared that his father had stood like a mountain between him and the wolves. Several police officers burst through the main doors with their hands resting cautiously on their belts, scanning the chaotic room. They saw me covered in grease and mud, standing next to my son in his crisp tuxedo. The venue manager quickly rushed over to the officers, waving his hands frantically, explaining the situation, trying to minimize the damage to the estate reputation. We gave our statements calmly and clearly. Trey handed over copies of the fraudulent wire transfers on his phone and explained the attempted assault. The officers, seeing the hard, undeniable evidence and the cowardly retreat of the bride family, simply nodded, taking notes and ensuring no further violence would occur. There would be no arrests tonight, at least not for us. The real crimes committed by Chloe and her father would be handled by the courts and the federal authorities. When we were finally cleared to leave, the venue was entirely empty. The beautiful string music had long since been silenced. The extravagant party was a total wreckage of dropped napkins, spilled drinks, and shattered illusions. Trey walked over to me. He reached out and wrapped his arms around my filthy coveralls, pulling me into a tight, fierce embrace. He did not care about the mud or the grease transferring onto his expensive tuxedo jacket. He told me he loved me. He thanked me for saving him not just from the power failure, but from a lifetime chained to a family of vultures. We turned our backs on the Piedmont estate and walked out through the grand front doors together. We stepped out into the warm, humid Georgia night, leaving the toxic wreckage of Richard World far behind us. We walked side by side down the long, sweeping driveway toward my beat-up work truck. We had no money left from the wedding fund, and Trey was walking away from a life of promised luxury. But we had our dignity, our truth, and our unbroken bond. We walked with our heads held incredibly high, knowing that we had faced down the devil and walked away clean. 3 days had passed since the catastrophe at the Piedmont estate. The adrenaline that had fueled my veins that night had slowly faded, leaving behind a deep, exhausting ache in my bones. Trey had moved his things into my guest room. He could not stomach the idea of returning to the luxury apartment he had shared with Chloe. We spent those 72 hours in a quiet state of decompression. We ordered takeout, watched old basketball games on the television, and barely spoke about the wedding. I thought we had successfully amputated the diseased limb from our lives. I believed the worst was finally behind us and that my son could now begin the slow process of healing. I was incredibly foolish to underestimate the vindictive nature of a humiliated billionaire. It was a muggy Tuesday evening. We were sitting at my worn kitchen table eating leftover ribs and cornbread. The heavy summer rain was drumming against the roof, providing a comforting rhythm to the quiet house. Then a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the front door. It was the kind of knock that immediately signals bad news. I wiped my hands on a paper towel and walked down the hallway. When I opened the door, a short man in a wrinkled gray suit was standing on my porch, shielding himself from the rain with a black umbrella. He held a thick manila envelope sealed with red tape. He looked past me and locked his eyes on my son, who had stepped out of the kitchen behind me. The stranger asked if he was speaking to Trey. When my son nodded, the man simply shoved the heavy envelope into Trey's chest, turned around, and jogged back to his idling sedan. He did not say another word. He just drove away into the stormy night. Trey stood in the entryway holding the envelope like it was a live explosive. His hands began to tremble. He tore the thick paper open and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the first page. Within seconds, all the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw slacked, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the hallway wall. He slid down to the floor, clutching the papers as if they were physically crushing him. I dropped to my knees right beside him. I asked him what was wrong, but he could not speak. He just handed me the thick stack of papers. I put on my reading glasses and focused on the bold black text at the top of the page. It was a formal summons and complaint filed in the Superior Court. The plaintiff was Richard and his massive corporate holdings firm. The defendant was my son. I read through the dense, confusing legal jargon, struggling to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal laid out before me. About 6 months before the wedding, Trey had launched a brilliant technology startup. He had designed a revolutionary software platform that streamlined complex legal document reviews. It was a genius piece of coding that had the potential to change the entire industry. When Richard found out about the project, he had swooped in, playing the role of the generous, supportive future father-in-law. He offered Trey a massive angel investment to get the software off the ground. Richard had smiled his fake predatory smile, slapped Trey on the back, and told him that family always takes care of family. Trey, being young and trusting, had signed the investment contract, believing he was solidifying his future with his new family. But Richard was never building a family. He was building a trap. I flipped to the 4th page of the lawsuit and found the poison. Buried deep within 50 pages of convoluted corporate clauses was a highly deceptive stipulation. It was labeled as a breach of morality and reputational damage penalty. The legal language was deliberately vague, but incredibly lethal. It essentially stated that if Trey engaged in any public behavior that brought severe embarrassment, scandal, or reputational harm to Richard or his affiliated entities, the entire investment would be immediately recalled with staggering punitive damages. Because Trey had taken the microphone at the wedding, because he had publicly exposed Chloe as a thief and humiliated her wealthy family in front of Atlanta's most elite society, Richard was legally claiming that Trey had triggered the morality clause. The numbers printed at the bottom of the page made my stomach violently churn. Richard was not just asking for his initial seed money back. He was suing my son for $2 million in punitive damages. The lawsuit explicitly demanded that if Trey could not produce the $2 million within 30 days, Richard would legally seize complete ownership of the startup. He would take all of Trey's intellectual property, all his proprietary code, and every single future earning tied to the software. Richard was trying to financially execute my boy. He wanted to strip him of his life's work and leave him bankrupt, drowning in inescapable debt out of pure, unadulterated spite. He wanted to prove that no one could cross his family and survive. I looked down at Trey. My brilliant, strong, educated son was sitting on the hardwood floor, crying quietly into his hands. His spirit was completely broken. He had poured his heart and soul into that software company. It was his ticket to making a real mark on the world, and now a wealthy tyrant was going to steal it all with a stroke of a pen. Trey looked up at me with eyes full of absolute despair. He whispered that it was over. He said Richard had too much money and too many connections, and no judge would ever rule against him. I felt a dark, terrifying rage ignite in the very center of my chest. This was no longer just about a ruined wedding or a stolen $100,000. This was a battle for my son's entire future. Richard thought he could crush us under the weight of his expensive lawyers and his country club privilege. He thought we would just lay down and surrender because we were working-class black folks who did not have the resources to fight back. He vastly underestimated the protective fury of a father who had spent 40 years building a life from dirt and grease. I tightened my grip on the lawsuit and swore to myself that I would tear Richard's empire to the ground. The days that followed the arrival of that lawsuit felt like moving through thick, dark water. The vibrant, ambitious young man I had raised slowly disappeared behind a solid oak door down the hallway. Trey locked himself inside the spare bedroom he used as a home office. From sunrise until long past midnight, the only sounds echoing through my house were the frantic clacking of his keyboard and the muffled, desperate tone of his voice on the telephone. He was a brilliant young lawyer fighting for the very life of his startup, but he was fighting a phantom. Richard did not just drop a $2 million lawsuit on my boy. He weaponized his immense wealth to build an invisible, impenetrable wall around him. Atlanta might be a sprawling, diverse metropolis, but at the very top of the corporate ladder, it operates like an incredibly small, exclusive club. Richard had spent decades buying favors, hosting extravagant charity galas, and filling the campaign coffers of local politicians and powerful judges. Now he was calling in every single one of those favors to completely choke the life out of my son. I watched helplessly as the brutal reality of our situation crushed Trey a little more each day. He would emerge from that office with bloodshot eyes and shoulders slumped so low he looked like he was carrying the physical weight of the entire world. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, pushing a plate of cold food around, and told me the bitter truth. Every single reputable law firm in the city had suddenly discovered a highly convenient conflict of interest the moment they saw Richard's name on the docket. Nobody wanted to cross a billionaire real estate tycoon with deep ties to the district attorney office. The financial institutions were even worse. Trey had poured his heart and soul into his legal software, but venture capitalists scatter like frightened roaches, when they smell a massive pending lawsuit. Bank managers took one look at the $2 million penalty clause and instantly denied his requests for emergency business credit. Richard was systematically suffocating him, cutting off his oxygen supply until he had no choice but to surrender his life work. Seeing my strong, highly educated son reduced to a hollow, defeated shell was a torment I cannot adequately describe. Trey looked up at me, his voice cracking, and apologized. He said he had failed us. He said he had thrown away everything I had worked for and everything his mother had sacrificed for him. He actually believed that this was his fault for trusting the wrong people. Hearing those words break from his lips was the exact moment my heartbreak entirely evaporated and a cold, terrifying rage took its place. I waited until Trey finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep on the living room sofa. The house was completely silent, save for the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning unit. I walked slowly into the formal dining room and stood directly in front of the large framed portrait of my late wife. Simone looked back at me with that gentle, knowing smile she always wore. The artist had captured the soft warmth of her brown eyes perfectly. I stood there in the quiet shadows of my home, remembering the exact smell of the hospital room where she took her last breath. I remembered the fragile weight of her thin hand in mine and the absolute fierce determination in her fading voice when she made me swear to protect our boy from the wolves of this world. She knew that despite all his brilliant book smarts, Trey possessed a deeply trusting heart that predators would inevitably try to exploit. I placed my large, calloused hand against the polished wood of her picture frame. My fingers were trembling violently, but it was not from fear or the weakness of old age. It was the physical manifestation of a profound, deep-rooted fury that I had kept buried inside my chest for decades. I had played the good, humble tradesman my entire life. I had smiled politely at arrogant, wealthy men who looked through me as if I were totally invisible. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace and provide a quiet, stable life for my family. But Richard had made a fatal miscalculation. He mistook my polite restraint for pure weakness. He thought because I wore a blue collar and worked with my hands that I lacked the intellect, the resources, and the sheer grit to fight him on his own turf. He believed his money made him an untouchable god in this city. I looked deeply into Simone-painted eyes and spoke softly into the empty room. I promised her that no one was going to destroy our son. I swore on everything I had built and every drop of sweat I had poured into the Georgia soil over the last 40 years that I would not let a greedy, entitled tyrant steal Trey's future. Richard wanted a war, but he only knew how to fight from behind expensive mahogany desks with dirty contracts and slick corporate lawyers. He had never been in a real street fight. He had never faced a man who knew how to dismantle a massive complex structure piece by piece until the entire foundation collapsed into dust. I pulled my hand away from the portrait. The trembling had completely stopped. My mind was no longer clouded by shock or the heavy weight of grief. It was running with the sharp, precise efficiency of a master contractor assessing a condemned building. If Richard wanted to use his corporate empire to crush my family, then I simply had to find the structural flaws in his empire and blow the foundation to pieces. I walked into my own home office and turned on the heavy brass desk lamp. I did not need a fancy law degree from an Ivy League university to know exactly how the murky world of high-end real estate development operated. I knew how subcontractors were hired, how municipal bids were rigged, and how men like Richard hid their dirty money behind layers of corporate shell companies. I sat down in my worn leather chair, opened my heavy metal filing cabinet, and prepared to take matters into my own two hands. The time for playing nice was officially over. It was time to go to work. The glow of the small brass desk lamp cast a harsh yellow circle over the lawsuit spread across my blotter. I sat alone in the quiet hours of the early morning, reading the document that was meant to destroy my son. Richard had paid highly expensive lawyers to draft this weapon, using 50 pages of dense, intimidating legal jargon. To a regular person looking at it for the first time, it probably looked like an impenetrable fortress of corporate power. But when you have spent 4 decades running an independent commercial contracting business, you learn how to read between the lines of a contract. You learn how to spot the hidden traps, the escape clauses, and the layers of corporate insulation rich men use to protect their wealth. I took a long sip of lukewarm black coffee and let my eyes trace the list of affiliated entities filed under the primary real estate portfolio Richard owned. These were the shell companies, the holding firms, and the silent partnerships that made up his sprawling empire. I read through names that sounded deliberately generic, like Summit Properties and Oak Valley Investments. But halfway down the 3rd page, my index finger suddenly stopped over a very specific listing. The ink seemed to burn right through the page. Vanguard Municipal Solutions. My heart gave a heavy, pronounced thud against my ribs. I read the name out loud to the empty room, letting the syllables hang in the quiet air. It was a name I had not seen or thought about in over 3 years, but it carried a very specific and bitter memory. Richard thought he operated in an elevated sphere, completely detached from the working-class people he despised. He forgot a very fundamental truth about his industry. Rich developers might cut the ribbons and take the glamorous photographs, but men like me actually build their empires. We crawl through their tight ventilation shafts, we wire their complex security systems, and we see exactly where they cut their illegal corners. 3 years ago, my commercial heating and cooling company won a lucrative bid to handle the ventilation systems for a massive federal infrastructure project in downtown Atlanta. It was a government-subsidized initiative meant to revitalize a crumbling sector. The project was supposed to be a straightforward, honest job. But from the first week, the operation smelled rotten. The management company was a bureaucratic nightmare. They delayed vital shipments, demanded we use subpar materials against building codes, and their payment structures were bizarre. Instead of receiving our scheduled checks directly from the city treasury, my invoices were always paid by a third-party intermediary. The checks were drawn from an obscure management group called Vanguard Municipal Solutions. I remembered fighting with their accounting department on the phone for hours, just trying to get my crew paid on time for their back-breaking labor. The man who supposedly ran Vanguard never once stepped foot on the job site. He was a phantom hiding behind lawyers and accountants. We eventually finished the job, got our money, and I swore I would never work with that shady outfit again. And now here was Vanguard Municipal Solutions listed in black and white as a direct subsidiary of the corporate firm Richard controlled. The implications struck me like a massive bolt of lightning. This arrogant billionaire was not just ripping off local florists and caterers to fund his daughter and her lavish lifestyle. He was skimming massive amounts of money off federally funded infrastructure projects. He was using fraudulent shell companies to pocket honest taxpayer dollars while forcing dedicated subcontractors to use cheap, dangerous materials and shoulder all the structural liability. I pushed my chair back from the desk, listening to the wheels grind against the hardwood floor. I walked down the hall and opened the door to the heavy fireproof storage closet where I kept all my archived business records. The air inside smelled of dry paper and old ink. I reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a heavy cardboard banker box labeled with the year of that specific federal project. My damaged back ached in protest as I hauled the box over to the desk and dropped it down with a heavy thud. I flipped open the lid and began digging with a frantic energy. I bypassed the standard payroll sheets and quarterly tax filings, hunting exclusively for the client invoices. I pulled out a thick stack of yellow carbon copy invoices and bank deposit slips. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the house was the rustling of paper as I meticulously sorted through the financial history of that job. I cross-referenced the routing numbers, the tax codes, and the authorizing signatures from my old Vanguard checks, with the registry details listed on the lawsuit Richard served my son. I am not an accountant, but you do not need an advanced degree to match identical sequences of numbers. Every single digit lined up perfectly. Richard had set up Vanguard as a temporary illegal shell. He used it to bid on lucrative government contracts, secure millions in federal funds, and funnel that money straight into his private real estate ventures. He paid guys like me pennies to install cheap systems while he kept the grants meant for urban development. It was a classic illegal embezzlement scheme. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mountain of undeniable proof spread across my desk. The exhaustion of the early morning completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, buzzing surge of adrenaline. Richard had filed this ridiculous lawsuit to bankrupt my son out of pure spite, believing we were helpless victims who would simply roll over and accept a humiliating defeat. He had no idea that by trying to financially execute Trey, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to tear his entire life apart. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a thick, humid fog hanging heavy over the industrial park on the outskirts of Atlanta. I pulled my battered work truck up to the rusted chain-link fence of the off-site storage facility I had rented for over 2 decades. The main gate was locked tight for the night. The security guard was nowhere to be seen. I grabbed my heavy-duty bolt cutters from the truck bed and walked toward the side access gate. I knew the property layout like the back of my hand. I slipped through the perimeter and made my way down the long, narrow row of corrugated metal units. I stopped in front of Unit 412. I had lost the tiny brass key to this specific padlock years ago because I never thought I would need to open it again. With a sharp grunt and a heavy thrust of my shoulders, the thick metal lock snapped in two. The corrugated door rolled up with a loud, deafening screech that echoed through the empty lot. The smell of stale air, damp concrete, and decaying cardboard hit my face instantly. I clicked on a high-beam battery-powered work light and set it down on a stack of wooden pallets. The unit was packed floor to ceiling with hundreds of heavy banker boxes. 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears were stuffed into these dusty containers. Every invoice, every payroll stub, and every material receipt from my entire career was buried in this room. I knew exactly what I was looking for. The digital files I found earlier were a good start, but the original physical carbon copies held the undeniable truth. I started pulling down heavy boxes, coughing violently as decades of settled dust filled my lungs. My bad knees throbbed with a dull, agonizing pain as I knelt on the cold concrete floor, ripping away peeling packing tape with my bare hands. Box after box yielded nothing but routine tax returns and old equipment warranties. I was beginning to feel a creeping, suffocating sense of defeat. Maybe Richard was too smart to leave a physical paper trail. Maybe the billionaire real estate tycoon had covered his tracks perfectly. But men like Richard are deeply arrogant. They believe they are completely untouchable, and arrogance always breeds devastating carelessness. Finally, near the very back of the storage unit, hidden beneath a pile of old canvas drop cloths, I found a box labeled with the specific municipal infrastructure project codes from 3 years ago. I pulled out a thick, heavy black binder. As I flipped through the stiff, yellowed pages, the scattered pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap into place. I found a physical copy of the master contract submitted to the federal government. I read the front page and my heart completely stopped beating. My company name was listed as the primary general contractor for the entire multi-million-dollar municipal development. I stared at the paper in absolute disbelief. I was never the primary contractor. I was just a lowly subcontractor hired to do the commercial ventilation and cooling systems. As I read further down the page, the sickening reality of Richard and his massive corporate scheme became crystal clear. He had explicitly registered my business as a minority-owned business enterprise on the federal application. The federal government sets aside a specific massive percentage of highly lucrative infrastructure contracts exclusively for minority-owned firms to ensure fair competition. Richard and his wealthy shell company Vanguard Municipal Solutions did not qualify for a single dime of those millions. But my black-owned tradesman business did. Richard had completely stolen my company identity. He used my name, my decades of spotless reputation, and my minority status to illegally win massive federal grants. Once the government awarded the lucrative contract to my name, Richard used Vanguard as a fraudulent intermediary to completely hijack the funds. I found dozens of payment authorizations and bank routing slips stacked in the back of the binder. They showed millions of taxpayer dollars flowing from the city treasury directly into offshore accounts, controlled entirely by Richard and his holding firms. He took the massive government payouts while paying me absolute pennies to do the actual physical labor. I remembered crawling through dangerous, unventilated ductwork, tearing up my shoulders and risking my life on those job sites. While I was breaking my back for an honest wage, Richard was sitting in a plush country club, illegally funneling my federal money into his private real estate ventures. But he needed my authorization to make that kind of money move. The banks would never release federal funds without the primary contractor signing off. I frantically dug deeper into the binder, pulling out the official financial release forms. I stared at the bottom of the pages, holding my breath. There was my signature. Except I had never signed these papers in my entire life. I held the documents dangerously close to the harsh glare of my work light. The loops and curves were a very good imitation, but they were undeniably forged. The pen pressure was entirely wrong. The slant was too perfect. Richard had hired someone to meticulously copy my handwriting to illegally release millions of dollars. He had committed massive federal fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement on a scale I could barely comprehend. My hands shook violently as I held the forged documents. The sheer magnitude of his crime was staggering. This arrogant billionaire had not just ruined my son's wedding or tried to bankrupt Trey out of spite. He had committed a major federal felony using my black identity to steal millions from the government. He looked down on me, called me a dirty janitor, and treated me like trash, all while secretly using my name to build his massive empire. A dark, powerful justice filled my chest. I had the physical proof right in my dirty, calloused hands. Richard was going to lose absolutely everything. The sun came up over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. I had not slept a single wink. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the heavy black binder full of forged documents and federal contracts. Richard thought he held all the cards. He thought he could use my name, my race, and my lifetime of honest labor to line his silk pockets and then turn around and destroy my son. But he had made the biggest mistake of his arrogant life. I needed heavy artillery to take down a billionaire. I needed someone who operated at the highest levels of the justice system, but who still remembered exactly where he came from. I picked up my phone and called a man I have known since we were young boys, sitting in the wooden pews of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Roland Davis and I grew up on the exact same tough streets. While I built my life with calloused hands and copper wire, Roland fought his battles with law books and courtrooms. Today, he is one of the most feared and respected federal prosecutors in the entire Southern District. He is a brilliant, ruthless African-American man who has made a long career out of taking down corrupt politicians and greedy corporate titans. When I told him it was an absolute emergency, he told me to come straight to his downtown office. I walked past the marble columns and security checkpoints, clutching my battered cardboard box. I did not care that my heavy work boots squeaked loudly against the polished floors, or that his fancy receptionists looked at my faded canvas jacket with questioning eyes. Roland met me at the heavy oak doors of his corner office. He gave me a firm, brotherly hug, slapping my back with genuine warmth. We sat down at his massive glass conference table, and I laid the black binder right in the center. I did not waste time with polite small talk. I opened the metal rings and laid out the entire ugly truth. I walked Roland through every single detail. I showed him the initial angel investment contract where Richard tried to steal Trey Software Company using that fraudulent morality clause. Then I showed him the devastating truth hiding behind the lawsuits. I pulled out the federal infrastructure bids, the tax forms, and the fraudulent payment authorizations from Vanguard Municipal Solutions. I explained how Richard had stolen my company identity using my minority-owned business status to illegally secure millions in federal funds. I placed the forged signatures side by side with my real ones, showing how his shell companies funneled taxpayer money straight into his private real estate empire. Roland sat perfectly still. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the yellowed invoices and the bank routing numbers. For a long time, the only sound in that lavish office was the soft hum of the city traffic 14 floors below. When Roland finally looked up, his face was a mask of pure, absolute shock, mixed with a deep, professional fury. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. He told me that in all his years prosecuting white-collar crime, he had rarely seen an embezzlement scheme so blatantly arrogant and deeply offensive. Richard was running a massive criminal enterprise, a literal racketeering operation, right under the nose of the federal government. He was using the very programs meant to uplift our community to stuff his own overflowing bank accounts. Roland slammed his hand down on the glass table. He said the audacity of this man to steal my business identity and then try to bankrupt my son in broad daylight was a level of evil that required immediate and total destruction. Roland looked me right in the eye and said, "We are not just going to stop his lawsuit against your boy. We are going to completely annihilate Richard's entire empire. We are going to seize his assets, freeze his bank accounts, and put him in a federal penitentiary for a very long time." But Roland warned me that a man with Richard wealth and deep political connections would squirm out of a standard basic indictment. If we just handed this over to local authorities, Richard would hire a fleet of expensive defense attorneys to delay the courts, bribe the right officials, and bury the evidence. We needed to spring a trap so tight and so sudden that Richard would have absolutely no room to breathe. We spent the next 4 hours locked in that office, drawing up a meticulous, bulletproof battle plan. Roland called in 2 trusted forensic accountants from his elite federal task force. We mapped out the flow of the dirty money, tracking every single stolen federal dollar from my hijacked business profile directly into Richard offshore accounts. We built an ironclad paper trail that connected the billionaire directly to the fraudulent shell corporation. The accountants worked with ruthless efficiency, verifying the forged signatures and preparing the necessary federal warrants under absolute secrecy. The plan we devised was beautiful in its perfect precision. We would let Richard believe he was winning the game. We would let him march into the upcoming civil mediation hearing for the lawsuit against my son, acting like the untouchable king of Atlanta. We would let him sit there with his smug, racist grin, demanding Trey surrender his technology startup and his entire future. And right at the exact moment Richard thought he had completely destroyed my family, we would drop the federal hammer. Roland promised me that he would personally coordinate a massive tactical raid on Richard corporate headquarters. He would time the strike to happen at the exact same hour as our mediation meeting, ensuring Richard could not access his funds or his fixers. As I gathered my files and walked out of that federal building into the bright afternoon sun, my heavy heart felt lighter than it had in months. The crippling fear and despair that had choked my house were entirely gone. We were about to show this arrogant billionaire that working-class folks do not just roll over and disappear. We were going to teach him a permanent, unforgettable lesson about respect, family, and absolute justice. I have spent my entire life relying on a very specific set of tools. Give me a heavy-duty voltage meter, a pair of insulated wire strippers, and a solid wrench, and I can solve just about any problem sitting in front of me. I am a man of concrete and copper wire. But the tools spread across Roland's massive glass conference table the next morning were entirely foreign to me. They were not meant to build a house or fix a blown commercial circuit. They were designed to tear down a corrupt empire. Roland had called in his top technical surveillance team from the federal task force. Two serious-looking agents in plain clothes stood by the window, while Roland handed me a crisp, light blue dress shirt. It looked like any standard button-down you would buy off the rack at a department store. But Roland tapped the second button from the top with his pen. He explained that housed inside that tiny piece of plastic was a state-of-the-art, multi-directional microphone directly linked to a secure federal server. He then handed me a heavy silver wristwatch. It felt cold and substantial against my palm. The agent stepped forward and pointed out a microscopic pinhole lens flawlessly integrated into the number 12 on the watch face. Roland looked me dead in the eye and laid out the absolute gravity of the situation. He told me that physical documents and bank routing numbers were powerful, but high-priced defense attorneys could tie up a paper trail in the courts for years. They could blame rogue accountants or rogue lower-level managers. To make this federal racketeering case completely bulletproof, we needed the architect himself to brag about the blueprints. We needed Richard to confidently admit on high-definition video that he intentionally forged my signature, that he deliberately hijacked my minority business status, and that the $2 million lawsuit against my son was purely a malicious extortion tactic. To catch a predator of that magnitude, you cannot just lay out a piece of bait. You have to willingly make yourself the prey. Roland sat back in his chair, folded his hands, and told me I was about to perform the hardest acting job of my entire life. I had to convince a ruthless, arrogant billionaire that he had completely won. I had to swallow every single ounce of my pride, suppress the raging fire burning in my chest, and play the role of the defeated, broken old man begging for mercy. I stared at the silver watch in my hand. I thought about the hollow look of utter despair in my son's eyes when he received that lawsuit. I thought about Trey locking himself in his room, leaving his brilliant future was entirely destroyed. A father will do absolutely anything to protect his child. Swallowing my pride was a tiny, insignificant price to pay to get my boy his life back. I put the watch on my wrist, strapped it tight, and nodded at Roland. I told him I was ready. One of the agents handed me my cell phone. I pulled up Richard's private contact number, the one I had saved during the brief, terrible period we were supposed to become family. My thumb hovered over the glowing green call button. I closed my eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and let out a long sigh to force the tension out of my vocal cords. I needed to sound small. I needed to sound completely crushed. I pushed the button and put the phone to my ear. The line rang 3 times. Every ring felt like an eternity. Finally, the line clicked open. Richard did not say hello. He did not offer a standard greeting. He simply answered the phone with a dry, amused chuckle. He asked me if I was enjoying the severe weather. He said he heard the financial forecast for my son was looking incredibly bleak these days. The sheer arrogant venom in his voice made my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. I wanted to scream into the receiver. I wanted to tell him that his days as a free man were rapidly coming to an end. But I bit my tongue hard, tasting the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I hunched my shoulders physically, forcing my posture into a submissive slump to make my voice sound weaker. I spoke softly, letting a deliberate tremor bleed into my words. I told Richard that he had won. I said the lawsuit had completely ruined us. I explained that Trey could not secure a single bank loan, that no lawyer in the city would touch our case, and that my son was on the verge of a total nervous breakdown. I practically whispered into the phone, telling him that we had absolutely no money left to fight his massive corporate legal team. Richard let out a long, satisfied sigh. It was the sound of a man relishing the absolute destruction of a supposed lesser human being. He told me that actions always have consequences. He said Trey needed to learn a very hard lesson about disrespecting his betters, and that my family should have known our proper place before we decided to open our mouths at the Piedmont estate. I forced a subtle, pathetic sob into my throat. I begged him to leave Trey alone. I pleaded with him to drop the punitive damages and spare the boy from total bankruptcy. I told Richard I would agree to absolutely anything if we could just sit down face to face and negotiate a total surrender of the software company. I offered to sign away all of Trey intellectual property right over to him in exchange for dropping the $2 million penalty. I could practically hear the greedy gears turning in Richard's head. The prospect of legally seizing a brilliant multi-million-dollar tech startup for absolutely nothing, while simultaneously humiliating the father who had pinned him to a marble floor, was simply too intoxicating for his massive ego to resist. He thrived on complete domination. Richard's tone shifted to an icy imperial command. He told me he was a very busy man, but he could spare 20 minutes to collect my total surrender. He refused to meet at an office. He demanded we meet on his exclusive home turf to maximize my humiliation. He told me to come to the Oak Ridge Country Club the following afternoon. He specifically instructed me to use the service entrance so my beat-up truck would not offend the other wealthy members. He laughed one last time, telling me not to be late before abruptly terminating the call. I pulled the phone away from my ear and set it gently on the glass table. I looked across the room at Roland and the two federal agents. The blue shirt with the hidden microphone lay neatly folded beside me. The silver watch ticked softly on my wrist. The bait had been cast, and the monster had bitten down hard. I was going to walk straight into the lion den, but this time the lion had absolutely no idea he was being hunted. The drive up the long, winding oak-lined driveway of the Oak Ridge Country Club felt like descending straight into the belly of the beast. The sprawling emerald lawns and the pristine white columns of the clubhouse were explicitly designed to keep people like me out. Following Richard's degrading instructions, I bypassed the grand main entrance and parked my battered heavy-duty work truck near the delivery loading dock out by the kitchen. The valet attendants in their crisp white vests stared at my rusted fender with absolute unhidden disdain. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the silver watch on my wrist and the stiff collar of the blue dress shirt hiding the federal microphone. I let my shoulders slump forward intentionally, dropping my chin and shuffling my feet. I walked through the narrow service corridor carrying the physical weight of a defeated, broken man. A condescending young manager in a tailored suit escorted me up a private back staircase to an exclusive dining room overlooking the 18th hole. Richard and Chloe were already seated at a long, polished mahogany table. The moment I walked through the heavy double doors, I was hit by the overwhelming smell of expensive perfume and aged leather. Chloe was casually sipping a brightly colored cocktail, completely unfazed by the absolute devastation she had unleashed on my son just a few days prior. Richard sat at the head of the long table like a feudal lord surveying his newly conquered land. He did not stand up. He did not offer his hand. He did not even offer me a simple glass of water. He just gestured vaguely toward a hard wooden chair at the far opposite end of the table, forcing me to sit as far away from them as physically possible. I pulled out the chair, slowly making sure my calloused hands trembled visibly as I rested them on the polished wood. Chloe leaned forward, swirling the ice in her crystal glass. She looked me up and down with that exact same aristocratic sneer she wore at the wedding. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed brightly off the wood-paneled walls. She told me she could smell my disgusting work truck from all the way across the room. She said it was an absolute miracle the club security even let me through the front gates, looking like a tired old mechanic who had just crawled out of a city sewer. She insulted the fit of my clothes, the dirt permanently stained under my fingernails, and the sheer absurdity of a blue-collar tradesman trying to negotiate with elite society. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, absorbing the vicious, classist poison. I had to let them completely feed their massive egos. I nodded slowly, looking down at the expensive carpet, and apologized softly, playing the role of the uneducated laborer who knew he was vastly out of his league. I begged them to leave Trey out of this mess. I pleaded with a cracked, desperate voice, telling them my boy was completely ruined and asking what it would take to make the $2 million lawsuit just disappear. Richard steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the table with supreme, overwhelming arrogance. He leaned back in his leather chair, smiling like a hungry predator who had successfully cornered his helpless prey. The tiny microscopic microphone hidden in my top button was picking up every single syllable. He told me the lawsuit was never actually about a morality breach. He chuckled a deep, ugly sound and admitted the entire angel investment contract was a deliberate, calculated trap right from day one. He bragged openly, completely intoxicated by his own untouchable power. He told me he knew Trey Legal Software was secretly worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had specifically engineered that vague morality clause just in case my boy ever tried to walk away or assert his independence. Richard boasted that he controlled the civil courts, the major banks, and the top venture capitalists in Atlanta. He said he immensely enjoyed watching my son squirm and suffer because it taught the younger generation who actually ran this city. He confessed to intentionally weaponizing his corporate influence to bankrupt Trey out of pure financial greed and personal spite. He told me that people like me and my son were nothing but stepping stones for men of his caliber. He proudly admitted that he drafted the legal documents specifically to bleed Trey dry until he had absolutely no choice but to sign over all the intellectual property for pennies on the dollar. Chloe chimed in, eager to share the bright spotlight of their cruelty. She openly mocked Trey for being so blindly trusting, laughing out loud as she admitted she only stayed engaged to him to secure her father investment scheme. She blatantly bragged about funneling my $100,000 directly to her gambling, addicted ex-boyfriend, calling me a gullible, pathetic old fool for blindly handing over my life savings to a family I did not even understand. I sat there listening to the two of them gleefully outline their entire criminal conspiracy. Every arrogant boast, every cruel laugh, and every clear, undeniable admission of fraud and extortion was being beamed directly to Roland, secure federal servers downtown. I kept my head bowed, letting the fake tears of a broken father fall silently, while my heart pounded with the cold, ruthless rhythm of a man holding the detonator to their absolute destruction. I asked Richard one final time if there was any humanity left in his heart, if he would just take the company and spare my son from the crushing debt. Richard smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and said the debt was the absolute best part of the deal. He had handed me the final nail for his own coffin. The quiet hum of the country club dining room was broken only by the sharp clink of ice against crystal. A white-coated waiter silently approached our table to clear Chloe's empty glass, but Richard waved him away with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. He wanted absolute privacy for his moment of total triumph. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, keeping my shoulders hunched and my eyes deliberately fixed on the polished wood. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing the sheer weight of Richard's massive ego to fill the room. The microscopic camera hidden behind the number 12 on my watch face was pointed directly at him, capturing every smug, arrogant line of his face. The multi-directional microphone behind my shirt button felt like a block of ice against my chest, but I kept my breathing slow and perfectly steady. I reached into my faded canvas jacket and pulled out a manila folder. I slid it across the smooth surface of the table. I told him in a quiet, trembling voice that I brought the final surrender papers. I said I was ready to sign over my son's entire software company, just like he demanded. Richard smiled, his eyes gleaming with a greedy, predatory hunger. He reached out to take the folder, but before his manicured fingers could touch the cardboard, I placed my large, calloused hand firmly on top of it. I looked up at him, letting my eyes fill with the perfect mixture of defeat and desperate confusion. I told him I would sign the papers, but I needed to know one thing first. I said I needed to understand, for my own sanity, why he targeted my family. I mentioned the lawsuit documents. I told him I saw the name of his primary holding company and the subsidiary listed directly underneath it. Vanguard Municipal Solutions. I let the name hang in the air, playing the part of a confused old man struggling to piece together a complicated puzzle. I told him I remembered doing a massive federal ventilation job for Vanguard 3 years ago. I asked him why a billionaire like him was hiding behind a tiny phantom management group that paid my crew pennies for backbreaking labor. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair and let out a deep, booming laugh. It was a laugh completely devoid of human empathy. He looked at me not as a fellow man, but as a mildly amusing insect that had somehow learned to speak. Chloe rolled her eyes, picked up her phone, and began scrolling, completely bored by the conversation. Richard decided to indulge me. Men drunk on their own perceived power simply cannot resist the urge to brag. They need an audience to validate their twisted genius. Richard steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the table. He told me the federal government was incredibly foolish. He explained with absolute chilling casualness that the city had allocated tens of millions of dollars in federal infrastructure grants specifically earmarked for minority-owned business enterprises. He said it was a massive pot of gold just sitting there waiting to be taken, but the bureaucratic red tape kept wealthy white developers like him from legally accessing the funds. He looked at me with a condescending smirk and said that was exactly where I came in. I widened my eyes, feigning pure shock. I asked him what he meant by that. I asked him if he used my company name. Richard poured himself another splash of amber bourbon from the crystal decanter on the table. He took a slow, deliberate sip, enjoying the theatrical suspense. He boasted that he did not just use my name. He completely hijacked my entire identity. He explained how his team of corporate lawyers and dirty accountants had intercepted my standard vendor applications. They realized my decades-old commercial contracting business had a spotless record and a certified minority-owned status. Richard proudly admitted that his team drafted the federal bids, placed my company name at the very top as the primary general contractor, and completely forged my signature on every single official document. I let my jaw drop slightly, making sure my silver watch remained perfectly angled toward his face. I stammered, acting horrified. I told him he stole my identity to win federal contracts. I said he took millions of taxpayer dollars meant to uplift our community and funneled it all into Vanguard Municipal Solutions. Richard nodded enthusiastically, clearly proud of his own criminal mastermind. He explained how Vanguard acted as the perfect invisible funnel. The city treasury released the massive federal grants directly to my hijacked company profile, and Vanguard immediately transferred those millions into a complex web of untraceable offshore accounts. He admitted he paid me a miserable fractional wage to do the actual physical labor, ensuring the buildings met the bare minimum codes, while he pocketed 90% of the government funding. He shifted all the structural liability onto my shoulders while he built his sprawling real estate empire with stolen taxpayer cash. I pushed myself back from the table slightly, letting my hands shake visibly. I raised my voice just enough to sound panicked and desperate. I told him that was a major federal crime. I said it was massive fraud and embezzlement. I told him if I went to the police or the district attorney with this information, he would go to prison for the rest of his life. Richard stood up from his chair. The movement was sudden and violently aggressive. He walked slowly down the length of the mahogany table until he was standing directly over me, looking down at me with absolute aristocratic disgust. The quiet hum of the dining room seemed to entirely vanish, replaced by the heavy pounding of my own heart. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne masking the rot in his soul. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the exact words Roland and the federal task force were waiting to hear. Go to the police, Calvin. Go to the Federal Bureau. Go scream it from the rooftops. Who is the government going to believe, an old black tradesman with dirt on his boots, or me? I fund their election campaigns. I pay their salaries. I used your name to steal millions, Calvin, and there is not a damn thing you can do about it. I looked up at his arrogant face. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. The facade of the broken old man entirely evaporated from my body, replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. I reached out, picked up the manila folder containing Trey software surrender documents, and calmly tore it directly in half. I dropped the shredded pieces onto the floor, right onto Richard's expensive Italian leather shoes. I told him he was absolutely right about one thing. He was completely out of my league. But I smiled a dark, knowing smile and told him the people listening to this conversation right now are definitely in his. The crisp late afternoon air hitting my face outside the Oak Ridge Country Club felt entirely different than it had just an hour ago. The heavy, suffocating weight of Richard and his arrogant daughter was completely gone. I walked past the pristine row of luxury imported cars and the sneering valet attendants with my head held high. My heavy scuffed work boots struck the flawless pavement with a steady, rhythmic purpose. I climbed into the cab of my battered work truck and let the old engine roar to life. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel, but it was not from fear or the crushing despair that had plagued my family for weeks. It was the pure electric surge of absolute vindication. I had walked into the lion den completely unarmed except for the invisible wire taped to my chest, and I had walked out carrying the very soul of his corrupt empire. I drove straight back to the Federal Building in downtown Atlanta. The afternoon traffic was a tangled mess of brake lights and frustrated commuters, but my mind was laser-focused. I kept glancing down at the tiny silver watch on my wrist and touching the hard plastic button on my collar. Roland was waiting for me in the secured underground parking garage flanked by two serious-looking technical agents. I stepped out of my truck and carefully unbuttoned the dress shirt, handing the highly sensitive recording equipment over to the senior technician. Roland did not say a word at first. He just placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder and gave me a firm nod. We took the private, secure elevator up to his executive office suite, where a team of forensic audio specialists immediately began extracting the digital files. We stood in the soundproof monitoring room, while the technicians ran the raw, unedited audio through their filtration software. Hearing Richard's voice echo through the high-definition speakers was a deeply surreal experience. The sheer venom and unchecked privilege in his tone was crystal clear. We listened in dead silence as he gleefully detailed his entire federal embezzlement scheme. We heard him brag about explicitly hijacking my minority-owned business status, forging my signatures, and routing millions of stolen taxpayer dollars through Vanguard Municipal Solutions directly into his private offshore accounts. And then came the final devastating nail. His voice boomed across the quiet room, openly mocking my working-class roots and daring the government to believe an old black tradesman over a billionaire political donor. Roland crossed his arms over his broad chest and let out a low, sharp whistle. He looked at the senior FBI agent, and a grim, highly satisfied smile spread across his face. Roland turned to me and said we had just captured the absolute holy grail of white-collar criminal prosecutions. Richard had not just confessed to a single isolated instance of fraud. He had laid out a multi-year federal racketeering conspiracy on a silver platter. The arrogant tycoon was so entirely convinced of his own untouchable supremacy that he freely admitted to trying to completely destroy my son's life just to satisfy his own malicious ego. Roland told me that men like Richard always fall because they severely underestimate the intelligence and the fierce resolve of the people they step on. The federal machinery moved with a terrifying and silent efficiency. Roland did not waste a single second. He immediately initiated an emergency asset freeze protocol coordinating directly with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Banking Commission. Because Richard had openly admitted to international wire fraud and siphoning massive federal infrastructure, grants the government had the absolute legal authority to lock down his entire financial portfolio without any prior public notice. I sat in a plush leather chair in the corner of the office, watching the massive digital grid on the monitoring screen light up as the agents systematically executed the federal warrants. It was a truly magnificent, glorious thing to witness. Within 30 minutes, the FBI and the IRS had thrown a massive invisible net over Richard's entire existence. They froze his primary domestic checking accounts, his vast corporate equity funds, and his heavily guarded offshore trust funds. They locked down the massive lines of credit attached to his commercial real estate holdings and flagged every single shell company connected to Vanguard Municipal Solutions. The absolute beauty of the operation was its total silence. Richard was likely sitting back at his exclusive country club, sipping his expensive, aged bourbon, completely oblivious to the fact that he was now entirely penniless. He could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone finance a massive corporate legal defense team. But Roland and I knew that simply arresting Richard in his lavish home would not be enough justice for what he had put my family through. The man needed to be completely exposed in the very place where he drew his dark power. He needed to be stripped of his massive ego right in front of his corporate enablers and fancy lawyers. We needed to bring him to the absolute peak of his arrogance before pulling the floor entirely out from under him. Roland looked at me and asked if I had one last performance left in my tired bones. I nodded, my heart pounding with a fierce, righteous anticipation. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line to Richard's executive assistant. When she answered, I forced my voice back into that pathetic, broken register. I told her that I had completely thought over Richard's generous offer at the country club. I said I realized I had absolutely no other choice but to accept his ruthless terms and surrender. I asked her to schedule a final official meeting at their main corporate headquarters the following morning, so I could sign over all the rights to my son's software company. I requested that Richard and his top lawyers be present to ensure the transition was entirely legal and permanent. The assistant placed me on a brief hold before returning to the line with a crisp, haughty tone. She confirmed the meeting for 10 in the morning at the Pinnacle boardroom of Richard downtown high-rise. She advised me to bring a valid form of identification and sharply warned me not to waste their highly valuable time. I thanked her profusely, playing the desperate, beaten father perfectly before ending the call. I looked up at Roland and the federal agents. The trap was officially set, and the bait was waiting. Richard thought he was going to walk into that boardroom to claim his final glorious victory over my family. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a devastating federal ambush that would wipe his corrupt name from the face of the earth. The morning sun was blinding as it bounced off the towering glass facade of Richard corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. I parked my old truck 3 blocks away in a public lot because I wanted the walk. I needed the cold morning air to steady my nerves and clear my head for the absolute performance of my life. Beside me, my boy Trey walked in total silence. His shoulders were slumped forward and his eyes were fixed on the concrete sidewalk. He looked exactly like a man marching straight toward his own execution. It took every single ounce of willpower I possessed not to wrap my arms around him and tell him the glorious truth. I wanted to tell him that Roland and the federal task force were already moving into position. I wanted to tell him that he was not losing his company today. But I knew Richard had eyes everywhere. If Trey walked into that building looking confident or relieved, the trap would completely fall apart. I had to let my son suffer for just a little while longer to secure his permanent freedom. We walked through the revolving glass doors and into a massive lobby that looked like an extravagant modern art museum. The floors were polished white marble that reflected our shoes with perfect clarity. Security guards in crisp black suits eyed us with immediate suspicion, knowing instantly that we did not belong in their pristine billionaire fortress. I gave my name to the young woman at the front desk. She typed on her keyboard, handed us 2 temporary visitor badges, and directed us to the private executive elevator. The ride up to the 50th floor was agonizingly quiet. The soft hum of the elevator cables was the only sound breaking the heavy, thick tension between me and my son. Trey finally looked up at me as the digital floor numbers climbed higher. He apologized softly, whispering that he never meant to drag me into this nightmare. He said he was so sorry I had to beg a man like Richard for mercy. I just squeezed his shoulder and told him to trust me. I told him no matter what happened in that room today, he needed to hold his head up high and remember exactly who raised him. The elevator doors glided open, and a tall, immaculate receptionist escorted us down a long hallway lined with expensive abstract paintings. We turned a corner and stopped in front of a massive glass-walled boardroom. The room was breathtakingly arrogant. It offered a panoramic sweeping view of the entire Atlanta skyline, serving as a visual reminder that Richard literally looked down on the rest of the city. Sitting at the far end of a massive polished mahogany table was the devil himself. Richard was dressed in a pristine, tailored navy suit, looking completely relaxed and perfectly in his element. To his right sat Chloe. She was tapping away on her expensive cell phone, sipping from a crystal glass of sparkling water, looking utterly bored by our arrival. To Richard's left sat a row of 3 highly paid corporate attorneys. They wore identical shark-like expressions, adjusting their silk ties and organizing thick stacks of legal documents. They looked like a pack of starving wolves waiting for the signal to tear us apart. We stepped into the room, and the heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us, blocking out all external noise. The silence in the room was absolute and entirely suffocating. Richard did not stand to greet us. He did not offer a handshake. He simply smiled a slow, calculating grin that made my stomach churn with pure disgust. He gestured toward 2 small, uncomfortable chairs positioned on our side of the massive mahogany table. He told us to sit down with a tone that sounded more like a command given to a disobedient dog. I pulled out a chair for Trey and then took my own seat, keeping my head lowered and my hands trembling slightly to maintain the illusion of a completely broken man. The tiny federal camera hidden inside my wristwatch was capturing every single arrogant sneer. The multi-directional microphone resting behind my shirt button was silently broadcasting every breath to Roland's secure command center. Chloe finally looked up from her phone. She let out a sharp, cruel sigh of pure annoyance. She complained loudly that we were 3 minutes late and said she had a very important spa appointment she needed to get to. She looked at Trey with absolute blistering contempt. She told him he looked absolutely pathetic and said it was a massive relief she did not actually have to marry into our depressing working-class family. Trey flinched visibly under the weight of her venom. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. I placed a calming hand over his wrist, silently urging him to keep his temper in check. I let them feed their own twisted egos. I absorbed every single vile insult, letting their arrogance inflate the room until it was ready to burst. I spoke softly, asking Richard if we could just get this terrible ordeal over with so my son could go home. Richard chuckled a deep rumbling sound of absolute victory. He nodded to his lead attorney, a slick man with slicked back hair and a predatory gaze. The lawyer smoothly picked up a thick, heavy stack of legal documents and slid them directly across the polished mahogany table. The papers stopped right in front of Trey. The bold, black letters at the top clearly stated it was a total and absolute forfeiture of all intellectual property rights. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, interlacing his fingers. He spoke with the quiet, confident authority of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He told Trey that this was the absolute end of the road. He said once those papers were signed, the software, the patents, and the entire future of the company would belong exclusively to him. Richard told my boy to pick up the pen and sign his life away or face a brutal, crushing legal battle that would leave our entire family homeless and destitute. The lead lawyer pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and set it deliberately on top of the forfeiture documents. He told us we had exactly 2 minutes to sign before they officially filed the $2 million damages claim with the civil courts. Trey stared at the gold pen like it was a venomous snake. I could see the absolute agony ripping through his soul. He was watching his brilliant dream, his years of coding and sacrificing, being stolen by a room full of greedy, arrogant parasites. Richard smiled that wicked, triumphant smile, completely drunk on his own unchecked privilege. He told me it was a real shame things had to end this way, but men like me simply did not have the power or the intellect to play at his elevated level. He was gloating, bathing in the sweet, toxic glory of his perceived victory. I sat perfectly still, letting the recording devices capture every single damning word of his extortion. The trap was fully loaded. The predator was standing right in the center of the snare. All I had to do was wait for the federal hammer to completely shatter his glass castle. The heavy air in that glass-walled boardroom felt thick enough to cut with a drywall saw. We sat in absolute silence for what felt like an eternity, watching the gold-plated fountain pen rest on top of the forfeiture documents. The room itself was a monument to corporate intimidation. It sat 50 floors above the streets of Atlanta, offering a sprawling panoramic view of the city I had spent my entire life building with my own 2 bare hands. Richard was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, staring at my son with a look of utter boredom. He did not see a brilliant young black man who had built a revolutionary software company from the ground up through sheer grit and intellect. He only saw a minor annoying obstacle standing directly between him and his afternoon tea time. The rhythmic sound of Richard tapping his thick manicured fingers against the polished mahogany table echoed through the quiet room. Tap, tap, tap. It was a calculated psychological tactic meant to rush us, meant to make us feel incredibly small and entirely insignificant. He checked the massive platinum watch on his wrist, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He looked directly at Trey and told him to stop dragging this tedious process out. Richard said the golf course was calling his name, and he had absolutely no intention of missing his pristine afternoon out on the green, just because some stubborn kid could not accept an obvious defeat. He pushed the thick stack of legal documents an inch closer to Trey, ordering him to sign the bottom line so they could all get on with their lives. Before Trey could even reach for the pen, Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She had been sitting there scrolling through her designer phone, entirely detached from the absolute devastation she was trying to inflict on the man she once promised to marry. She tossed her phone onto the table and leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. Her eyes were filled with a toxic venom that made my stomach turn physically sour. She looked at Trey with pure, blistering contempt and told him he was being absolutely pathetic. Chloe sneered at my boy, telling him he needed to wake up from his little fantasy world. She said he was never going to be one of them, and he was never going to sit at the big table. She laughed openly, stating that no matter how smart he thought he was always destined to end up exactly like me. A poor, exhausted nobody with dirt permanently stained under his fingernails. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at my faded canvas jacket and told Trey to take a long, hard look at his future. She said he was going to spend the rest of his life struggling to pay rent, driving a rusted-out work truck, and begging rich people for discarded scraps. She told him that signing over his company was the best thing he could possibly do because men from our background were simply not built to handle real wealth or real power. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every single drop of her classist poison. The tiny multi-directional microphone hidden behind my shirt button was picking up every vicious syllable she spat across that mahogany table. I could feel the intense heat radiating from my son. Trey was shaking with a suppressed fury. His jaw was clenched so tight, I could see the muscles jumping furiously in his cheek. He had poured his entire soul into his technology startup, working late nights and weekends, sacrificing his youth to build something meaningful and completely his own. Hearing this spoiled, entitled woman reduce his entire existence to a cruel joke was tearing him apart from the inside out. I moved my calloused, heavy hand across the table and placed it firmly over Trey, shaking knuckles. I squeezed his hand, pressing all my silent, enduring strength into his bones. I looked deeply into his eyes and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I could not speak the words out loud. I could not tell him that Roland and the federal task force were listening to this exact conversation from a secure command center downtown. I could not tell him that the invisible net was already closing tightly around Richard and his fraudulent empire. I just needed my boy to hold on for a few more agonizing minutes. I needed him to weather this brutal storm because the absolute clearing was just over the horizon. Richard chuckled, a deep rumbling sound of absolute unearned victory. He completely agreed with his vicious daughter. He told Trey that Chloe was just being brutally honest, and that the world was a very harsh place for people who did not understand their proper place in the food chain. He picked up the heavy gold pen and tapped it loudly against the glass table. He demanded Trey stop wasting his highly valuable time. He said he had a private foursome waiting at the country club, and he was not going to let a stubborn, defeated kid ruin his perfect afternoon. He told Trey to sign the paper, forfeit the company, and walk away back to his miserable life before things got genuinely ugly in the civil courts. I kept my head bowed, letting them feast endlessly on their own inflated egos. Richard and Chloe were so entirely blinded by their own perceived supremacy that they could not see the massive trap snapping shut right around their ankles. They thought their generational wealth and their elite status made them completely untouchable gods in this city. They truly believed they could steal my minority business identity, embezzle millions in federal infrastructure funds, and then financially execute my son without facing a single consequence. The sheer blinding level of arrogance in that room was suffocating, but it was also their ultimate permanent undoing. They were digging their own graves with every cruel insult and every impatient tap of that gold fountain pen. I watched Richard adjust his expensive silk tie, completely oblivious to the fact that his domestic and offshore bank accounts were already frozen solid by the federal government. He had absolutely no idea that armed federal agents were currently moving into position, ready to tear his pristine corporate fortress straight down to the foundation. Trey looked down at the forfeiture documents, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon meant to strip him of his entire life work. He slowly reached out and picked up the gold pen. The metal looked heavy and entirely foreign in his hand. He hesitated, the tip of the pen hovering just inches above the signature line. The silence in the room stretched so tight, it felt like a thick, physical wire ready to snap. Richard leaned in closer, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face, ready to claim his final stolen prize. But the pen never touched the paper. I sat there with my heart pounding against the hidden microphone, knowing that the calm before the storm was officially over. The heavy silence in that sprawling glass boardroom was so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Every eye in the room was locked onto my son. The gold fountain pen hovered just inches above the signature line. Richard sat back with a satisfied smirk, already tasting his unearned victory. Chloe was tapping her designer nails against the mahogany table, completely bored with the destruction of the man she once claimed to love. I watched Trey take a deep breath. His broad shoulders visibly relaxed. The fear and the crushing weight that had suffocated him for weeks suddenly vanished. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Chloe. He looked directly across the table at me. He saw the quiet, steady nod I gave him. Trey set the heavy gold pen down on the polished wood with a sharp, metallic clink. He placed both of his hands flat on top of the forfeiture documents and slowly slid them right back across the table. They stopped directly in front of Richard. Trey looked the billionaire dead in the eye and told him he would rather burn his own company to the ground than hand over a single line of code to a thief. The face of Richard contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. The smug billionaire grin melted away, instantly replaced by the vicious snarl of a predator who had just been denied his meal. He slammed his fist down on the table, demanding to know what kind of foolish game we were playing. He shouted that we had 10 seconds to sign those papers, or he would make sure we spent the rest of our miserable lives rotting in a debtor prison. His high-priced lawyers leaned forward, whispering urgent threats about immediate civil filings and asset seizures. But their threats meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, letting the joints in my bad knees pop. I did not slouch. I did not keep my head bowed. I stood up to my full height, squaring my shoulders and looking down at the men who thought they owned the world. I reached into the front pocket of my worn canvas jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. Richard demanded to know what I was doing. He yelled for his security guards, ordering them to remove the crazy old man from his pristine building. I ignored him completely. I walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the massive smart television mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. The screen was easily 90 inches wide, meant for displaying corporate projections and global real estate portfolios. I found the input port on the side of the sleek black frame and slipped the flash drive directly into the slot. I picked up the remote control, resting on the credenza, and pressed the input button. The screen flickered black for a brief second before blazing to life. I did not need a fancy law degree to know how to present ironclad evidence. I simply pressed play and turned around to watch the execution. The hidden camera footage from my wristwatch was crystal clear, and the audio from the microphone hidden in my shirt button filled the entire boardroom with perfect high-definition sound. There on the massive screen was Richard sitting at his exclusive country club, just 24 hours earlier. His own arrogant, booming voice echoed off the glass walls of his corporate fortress. The video showed him bragging with absolute chilling detail about his entire racketeering operation. We all watched as the digital version of Richard proudly confessed to hijacking my minority-owned business status. The audio was so crisp you could hear the ice clinking in his glass as he admitted to forging my signature to steal millions of dollars in federal infrastructure grants. The entire room listened as he gleefully explained how he funneled taxpayer money through Vanguard Municipal Solutions directly into his private offshore accounts. And then came the grand finale. His voice boomed across the boardroom, openly mocking the federal government and stating that no one would ever believe an old black tradesman over a billionaire political donor. The physical transformation in the boardroom was absolutely magnificent to witness. All the blood completely drained from the face of Richard, leaving him looking like a pale, gasping ghost. His jaw hung open in sheer, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, strangled sound escaped his throat. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the remote control from me, but his legs refused to hold his weight. He slumped back into his leather chair, a man completely destroyed by his own uncontrollable arrogance. But the reaction of his corporate lawyers was even more telling. These men were paid thousands of dollars an hour to protect his empire, but their survival instincts were sharper than their loyalty. The moment they heard their client openly confess to massive federal fraud on a crystal-clear recording, they physically jumped out of their chairs. They scrambled backward away from Richard as if he were suddenly highly contagious. The slick-lead attorney slammed his briefcase shut, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He knew instantly that sitting next to Richard meant sitting next to a walking federal indictment. They practically tripped over each other, rushing toward the glass doors, wanting absolutely no part of the massive federal hammer that was about to drop. Chloe sat frozen in her seat, entirely stripped of her cruel superiority. The designer handbag she loved so much slipped from her grasp and spilled onto the floor, but she did not even notice. Her eyes darted wildly between the giant television screen and her father gasping for air. She began to stammer, her voice high and trembling with pure terror. She tried to deny it, crying out that it was a fake video, that it was some kind of trick. But she knew the truth. She knew the lavish luxury life she had taken for granted was completely evaporating right before her very eyes. I walked back over to the mahogany table and stood next to my son. Trey was looking at me with a mixture of absolute awe and profound respect. The heavy, suffocating nightmare was finally over. We had walked into the belly of the beast and brought the whole corrupt temple crashing down. The final frame of the hidden camera footage froze on that massive television screen, leaving Richard enlarged and thoroughly exposed. The silence that followed was heavy and completely suffocating, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. Right on cue, the heavy glass and oak doors of the boardroom did not just open, they were violently kicked apart. The deafening crash shook the expensive mahogany table and rattled the crystal water glasses. A highly coordinated flood of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers poured into the pristine corporate sanctuary. There were at least a dozen of them, a synchronized mix of armed FBI personnel and grim-faced IRS criminal investigators. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the polished marble floor, shattering the quiet, elite atmosphere of the 50th floor. The lead agent stepped forward, holding a thick stack of federal warrants. He shouted with a booming voice of absolute authority, commanding everyone in the room to keep their hands visible and step away from the table. The sheer panic that erupted from the billionaire side of the room was the most glorious thing I have ever witnessed in my 67 years on this earth. Richard stumbled backward, his expensive leather chair tipping over and crashing to the ground. He completely lost whatever shred of aristocratic dignity he possessed. He began screaming frantically for his lawyers, demanding they fix the situation immediately. He shrieked about his political connections and his vast wealth threatening to ruin the careers of every single federal agent in the room. But his high-priced legal team wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. They were already standing flat against the far wall, with their hands raised high in the air, sweating profusely and practically begging the agents to search them. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and Richard was going down like a stone. Two heavily armed FBI agents ignored Richard's frantic screaming completely. They grabbed the arrogant tycoon by his tailored navy suit, spun him around with aggressive efficiency, and slammed him hard against the panoramic glass window. The billionaire face was pressed against the cold glass, looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta that he falsely claimed to rule. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists rang out like the sweetest gospel choir I had ever heard. On the other side of the room, Chloe was experiencing a total psychological collapse. The cruel, sneering woman who had just mocked my faded work jacket and my calloused hands was now hyperventilating in sheer, unadulterated terror. She grabbed her designer handbag, clutching it to her chest, as if it could somehow protect her from the devastating reality of the federal justice system. A stern female IRS agent approached her calmly, pulling the bag away and stepping directly into her personal space. The agent looked down at Chloe and delivered the final crushing blow with professional, icy precision. She informed the sobbing woman that as of exactly 5 minutes ago, every single one of her platinum credit cards, offshore trust funds, and luxury properties had been officially seized by the federal government under the racketeering statutes. The agent explained that everything Chloe owned was purchased with stolen taxpayer dollars, and she was now entirely, completely broke. Chloe let out a devastating guttural wail. Her legs gave out completely, and she dropped hard to her knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. Her immaculate makeup ran down her face in dark, muddy streaks as she sobbed hysterically, mourning the instant death of her unearned privilege. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and looked at my son. Trey was standing tall, his chest heaving, as he processed the monumental shift in our reality. The heavy, dark cloud of anxiety that had suffocated him for weeks was entirely lifted. He looked at me with a profound, newly discovered reverence. I reached out and pulled my boy into a fierce, tight embrace, wrapping my strong, working hands around his shoulders. I told him quietly that nobody was ever going to steal his future. I promised him that no matter how much money or power a man claimed to have, a father, love, and determination would always hit harder. We walked out of that glass boardroom together, leaving Richard and his daughter to face the brutal reality of their own making. We did not look back once. We strode past the bewildered corporate staff and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. When we pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out onto the Atlanta pavement, the bright morning sun hit our faces. The air tasted incredibly sweet. It was the crisp, clean air of total vindication. The aftermath was swift and absolute. Richard's fraudulent empire collapsed overnight. The federal prosecutors, led by Roland, dismantled his shell companies piece by piece, returning the stolen millions to the municipal treasury. Richard was formally charged with massive federal embezzlement, identity theft, and racketeering. With the overwhelming audio and video evidence providing a flawless confession, his high-priced lawyers forced him to accept a strict plea deal. The billionaire who thought he was a god among men is now facing the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his wealth, his name, and his freedom. Trey Software Company was entirely cleared of all malicious lawsuits, allowing my son to launch his brilliant technology and secure his own magnificent future. Life has an incredible way of balancing the scales. People who sit in high towers looking down on the working class always forget that we are the ones who built the foundations they stand on. If you push a quiet, honest man too far, you will quickly learn that calloused hands know exactly how to tear a corrupt structure down to the dirt. We must always protect our children fiercely and never let arrogant predators convince us that we are powerless. If my story resonated with your heart today, please hit that like button to bring a little sunshine to this father's soul. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life story. Please tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me incredibly happy to know which corner of the world is listening to my voice and what time of day it is for you. A big hug the size of my heart to all of you. See you in the next life story with love and respect. It took exactly 3 weeks for the dust to completely settle over the city of Atlanta. The sprawling, corrupt empire Richard had built on the backs of honest, hard-working people shattered into a million scattered pieces. The federal indictments came down fast and heavy, dominating the evening news cycle every single night. Richard was denied bail, entirely sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell, far away from his pristine, oak-paneled country club. Chloe was immediately evicted from her luxury downtown penthouse, leaving behind her designer handbags and her toxic sense of unearned superiority. She was forced to face a harsh, unforgiving reality where her family name meant absolutely nothing. Trey walked away from the entire devastating nightmare completely untouched. His revolutionary software company was fully liberated from their greedy, predatory claws. Without the crushing weight of that fake morality lawsuit hanging over his head, my boy secured massive, legitimate financial backing from honest tech investors. He was finally the undisputed master of his own brilliant destiny, moving forward without any leeches draining his hard-earned success. Fast forward to a warm, beautifully clear Friday evening. Trey came over to my small, modest house on the quiet residential side of town. We sat out together on the old wooden porch, sharing a heavy plastic cooler full of ice-cold beer. The beautiful Georgia sunset was slowly painting the vast open sky in deep, breathtaking shades of brilliant orange and dark velvet purple. We did not say much at first. We just sat there shoulder to shoulder, listening to the summer crickets waking up in the tall front grass and the distant, familiar hum of the working-class neighborhood settling down for the night. Children were laughing down the street, and a distant dog barked at the passing cars. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had choked my family for so many long, miserable months was completely gone, replaced by a profound, peaceful silence. The evening air tasted incredibly sweet and wonderfully fresh. I took a long, slow sip from my glass bottle, feeling the freezing condensation drip down my fingers. I looked over at my adult son, watching the fading golden sunlight catch the genuine, relaxed smile returning to his handsome face. He was no longer the broken, terrified boy sitting in that hostile corporate boardroom. He was a successful, independent man, entirely at peace with his beautiful world. Trey leaned back in his creaky wooden chair and let out a deep, contented sigh that seemed to carry away the last remnants of his lingering stress. He turned his head slowly and looked at me with a profound, quiet gratitude shining brightly in his dark brown eyes. He told me he never truly understood what it meant to be a real man until he watched me stand up to those arrogant billionaires without a single ounce of fear in my heart. He said he would never ever forget the exact glorious moment I slid that tiny silver flash drive into the television and brought a massive corporate giant straight down to his trembling knees. My son told me I taught him a vital lesson that day. I taught him that real lasting power does not come from a massive platinum bank account, a prestigious university degree, or an exclusive fancy country club membership. He said real power comes from an unbreakable human spirit, a righteous, honest heart, and a fierce, unconditional love for your family. Hearing those beautiful, sincere words come from my boy filled my chest with an emotion so incredibly powerful, it threatened to bring warm, happy tears to my old, tired eyes. I just nodded slowly, clinking my cold beer bottle against his, to acknowledge the deep, unbreakable mutual respect flowing endlessly between us. I looked down at my own hands resting quietly on my faded denim jeans. They were rough, heavy, and permanently scarred by decades of grueling physical labor. The thick, stubborn calluses on my palms and the deep lines etched into my knuckles told the long, difficult story of 40 years spent bending steel, pouring concrete, and breathing in toxic construction dust. Chloe had looked at these very same hands just a few weeks ago and seen only a pathetic, uneducated laborer worthy of absolute mockery. Richard had looked at these hands and seen a gullible, disposable tool to be ruthlessly exploited for his own massive financial gain. But sitting there on my peaceful porch, bathed in the fading evening twilight, I finally saw them for what they truly were. These rough, working man hands had carried my son when he was just a fragile little baby. They had worked countless grueling double shifts to pay for his college tuition and keep hot food on our humble table. And when the absolute darkest storm gathered over his head, threatening to destroy everything he had built, these same scarred hands were strong enough to tear a corrupt billionaire down to the dirt and save my boy life. A deep, overwhelming wave of pure, righteous pride washed over my entire soul. I realized right then and there that I did not need to wear a tailored Italian suit or sit at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table to be a true king. I was a loving, devoted father who had fiercely protected his own blood, and that made me the richest, most powerful man in the world. We watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the tree line, welcoming the quiet, comforting embrace of the night. Life has a truly incredible way of balancing the scales. It brings the arrogant and the wicked down to their knees, while elevating the humble who stand firmly in the truth. Never let anybody make you feel small just because your boots are dirty and your pockets are light. Real wealth is measured by the length you will go to protect the people you love. If my journey touched your heart today, please hit that like button to bring a little sunshine to this old father soul. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life stories I will tell with all my heart. And please tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me incredibly happy to know which corner of the country or the world is keeping me company today. A big, warm hug the size of my heart to all of you. See you in the next life story with love and respect. My friend's life has a very funny way of teaching us what truly matters in this world. We spend so much of our precious time on this earth chasing after things that shine and sparkle, thinking that money is the ultimate shield against the heavy hardships of reality. Money can certainly buy a fancy wedding dress stitched with the finest imported silk. It can buy a sprawling luxury penthouse with massive glass windows looking out over the entire city. It can buy fleets of expensive cars and exclusive memberships to high society country clubs where the waiters always know your name. But let me tell you a fundamental truth I learned the absolute hard way. Money can never buy character. It cannot buy a decent moral compass, and it definitely cannot buy a clean human soul. Never look down on a man wearing dirty, scuffed work boots, or a man with grease-stained hands. People who sit in tailored suits in elevated corporate towers might turn up their noses at the sight of dirt permanently lodged under a laborer's fingernails, but they completely fail to understand what that dirt actually represents. Beneath that thick physical grime is a heart of absolute solid gold. That dirt is the undeniable physical evidence of daily sacrifice. It is the living proof of a father who wakes up long before the sun rises, breaking his own back day after day, just to make absolutely sure his children have a sturdy roof over their heads and a fighting chance at a better life. A man with heavy, calloused hands knows the true heavy value of $1 because he has traded his own physical pain to earn it. And beneath that rough, weathered exterior is a protective heart entirely willing to walk straight through a roaring inferno to protect the ones he loves. I look back at Richard and his daughter Chloe now, and I do not feel any lingering anger in my chest. I honestly feel a profound sense of deep pity for them. They lived in a beautiful, fragile glass castle built entirely on lies, deception, and the silent suffering of innocent, hard-working people. They were so utterly blinded by their inherited wealth and their unchecked social privilege that they genuinely believed they were untouchable gods walking among regular, disposable mortals. They looked at my brilliant son and saw nothing but a convenient stepping stone. They looked at me and saw a foolish, tired old laborer they could easily crush under their expensive leather shoes. But arrogance, greed, and a false sense of superiority will always eventually dig your own grave. It is an unavoidable universal law of nature. You simply cannot build a lasting, powerful empire on a foundation of rotten, stolen timber. Eventually, the heavy termite of your own corruption will bring the entire massive roof crashing down directly onto your head. Richard raised a daughter who measured human worth entirely by bank balances and designer labels. He taught Chloe that cruelty was a virtue and that basic human compassion was a fatal weakness. He handed her the entire world on a silver platter, but he completely failed to give her a functioning moral compass. Now she has absolutely nothing, and she has no idea how to survive in the real forgiving world. On the other hand, I raised a son who knows exactly how to work hard, who respects the people around him, and who deeply understands the profound value of genuine, honest labor. Trey knows how to rebuild his life when things fall apart, because he watched his father do it 1,000 times over. The true measure of a successful parent is not what you leave for your children in a massive bank account, but what you leave inside their beating hearts. I built a life from absolutely nothing. I did not inherit a massive corporate trust fund or a sprawling real estate portfolio. I inherited a strong, unbreakable work ethic from my own father, and a stubborn refusal to ever stay down when life knocked me brutally into the dirt. Every single thing I own I earned with the honest sweat off my brow and the enduring strength in my shoulders. And there was absolutely no amount of inherited wealth, no army of high-priced corporate lawyers, and no corrupt billionaire who was ever going to take that away from my bloodline. When you finally reach my advanced age, you realize that the absolute most valuable currency in this entire world is peace of mind. It is the quiet ability to lay your heavy head down on your pillow at night and sleep soundly, knowing you have done right by your family and your fellow man. Richard is sitting in a cold, concrete federal prison cell right now, completely stripped of everything he ever valued. His fancy imported cars and his massive secure mansions could not save him from the heavy, brutal consequences of his own wicked actions. He foolishly traded his absolute freedom and his human soul for a few extra dollars he did not even need. Meanwhile, I get to sit on my modest wooden porch, sip a cold drink, and watch the beautiful setting sun with a completely clear conscience. I have my son, I have my dignity, and I have the unshakable absolute truth. That is real, authentic power. If there is one single thing I want you to take away from my long, difficult journey, it is this. Always stand up for what is right. No matter how massively terrifying the giant standing directly in front of you might seem. The world is full of arrogant bullies who use their immense wealth and their elevated status to intimidate good, honest people into silent submission. But a bully is nothing more than a weak coward hiding behind a very expensive mask. When you look them directly in the eye and refuse to back down, their stolen power completely evaporates. Truth and justice might take a long, agonizing time to arrive, but when they finally show up, they hit with the unstoppable force of a heavy freight train. Never surrender your basic human dignity. Protect your beautiful family with every single breath in your body. And always remember that the deepest, most profound strength comes from a pure and honest working heart. My friends, if my story warmed your heart today and brought a little bit of sunshine to your soul, please hit that like button right now. It means the absolute world to this old father. Please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next life stories I will share with all of my heart. And tell me down in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me incredibly happy to know which beautiful corner of the country or the world is keeping me company today, and what time of day you are listening to my voice. If you have ever had to stand up to a bully or fight to protect your own family, please share your amazing experience down below. I read every single comment, and I love exchanging stories with all of you. A big warm hug, the absolute size of my heart, to every single one of you. See you in the next life story with love and respect. We have reached the absolute end of this long, hard road together, my friends. When I sit back on my quiet porch and look at everything that transpired over these past few agonizing weeks, I am struck by a deep and profound sense of wonder. It is not every single day that the arrogant giant falls from his high tower. It is not every day that a man with dirt permanently worked into his boots and heavy grease stained under his fingernails gets to look a corrupt billionaire straight in the eye and watch his entire fraudulent empire crumble into a million pieces. If you felt a genuine swelling sense of justice watching an honest, hard-working father fight back and actually win against pure calculating evil, then I ask you to take just a moment to acknowledge that hard-fought victory. I know that so many of you listening out there understand exactly what it feels like to be completely underestimated and entirely overlooked by society. You know the unique, heavy ache of waking up long before the morning sun rises, putting on your heavy work boots and breaking your own back day after day, just to put decent food on the table for the people you love so fiercely. You know exactly what it is like to have individuals in fancy tailored suits look right through you, as if you are absolutely nothing but a disposable stepping stone on their endless path to greater wealth. But we know the absolute undeniable truth about this world. We know that the real enduring strength of this country does not reside in towering glass skyscrapers or exclusive country club boardrooms. It resides deep within the calloused hands of the men and women who actually build the very foundations those elite people walk upon. It lives and breathes in the pure, unconditional love of a parent who will absolutely walk through a roaring inferno without a second thought, just to protect their children from harm. That is the exact reason why I choose to sit down and share these deeply personal stories with you. I do not speak these difficult truths just to hear my own voice echo into the dark void of the internet. I share them because I firmly believe that our shared human experiences carry an immense, undeniable power. When one of us manages to stand up to a massive corporate bully and actually wins, it gives every single one of us a little more courage to face our own daily grueling battles. It reminds us that no matter how much money or political influence a predator might possess, they can never buy true character. So if this journey resonated with your spirit today, please hit that like button to show your wonderful support. Think of that simple action as a firm, solid handshake reaching across the vast digital divide. It is a powerful way of saying that you stand shoulder to shoulder with the fathers who refuse to give up and the humble families who refuse to be broken by greedy parasites. And please do not forget to subscribe to the channel right now. By officially joining this growing community, you ensure that you will never miss out on the next intense, true-to-life story I have to share with you. We are building a true brotherhood and a fierce sisterhood here. We are creating a safe gathering place for folks who value honor, integrity, and the undeniable, staggering power of the truth. We need to stick together in a world that so often tries to tear us apart. Now I have a very special and deeply personal favor to ask every single one of you listening to my voice right now. I want you to head down into the comments section below and let me know exactly what city or what beautiful country you are watching this video from. I also want you to tell me exactly what time it is right there in your specific corner of the world. You see, I am just an old, tired man who has spent the vast majority of his life working quietly in the background, never asking for the spotlight. The remarkable idea that my spoken words, my painful struggles, and my ultimate victories can travel across vast open oceans and endless sprawling continents to reach your ears is nothing short of a modern miracle to me. When I sit down in the quiet evenings and read your comments, I try my hardest to picture exactly where you are. Maybe you are sitting at your small kitchen table in Chicago, having your first morning cup of coffee before heading out to a long, grueling warehouse shift. Maybe you are riding a crowded evening bus through the bustling, chaotic streets of London, incredibly tired, but finding a brief moment of peace in this shared story. Or perhaps it is the middle of the quiet night in Sydney, and you are listening to my deep voice in the dark, finding a little bit of comfort and solitary strength before you finally drift off to sleep. Wherever you happen to be standing, sitting, or resting your weary head, it brings a truly tremendous amount of pure joy to this old man heart to know that my voice is reaching you. It reminds me that good, honest folks are stationed absolutely everywhere, holding the line against the gathering darkness. Life is an incredibly unpredictable and often turbulent journey, my friends. It will throw devastating storms your way when you least expect them, and it will introduce you to people who carry nothing but malice and extreme greed in their cold, empty hearts. But you must never let the cruelty of a few broken individuals extinguish the bright, beautiful light shining inside your own soul. Keep your family incredibly close. Hug your children tight, and never miss a single opportunity to tell them how much they mean to you. Protect your humble home and guard your hard-earned peace of mind against anyone who tries to disrupt it with deception. Stay entirely safe out there in whatever circumstances you find yourself facing today. I will be right here, waiting on this porch, ready to share the next powerful chapter with you very soon. With all my love and my deepest absolute respect, I bid you a wonderful day.